Cool Figure TV.
Come here, please.
Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution, and the war in America begins. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Let's get right into the content. Salute.
More than a dozen U.S. tiltrotor aircraft, MB-22 Osprey, were filmed taking off from a base in Puerto Rico amid anticipation of an announcement from Trump, possibly related to Venezuela. Flight radar also showed the Ospreys recently appearing in northern Venezuela near Puerto Rico. Information and videos circulated online around October 23 that the aircraft would be carrying U.S. Marine Corps personnel to the Venezuelan coast, planning a major strike under the pretext of an attack on Venezuelan drug cartels. Sources speculated that if the U.S. were indeed preparing a ground invasion on Venezuela, it could be preparing an amphibious operation supported by WASP attack helicopters. In such a scenario, the Marines would land near the Venezuelan coast. Sources reported that Caracas Airport had been closed to civilian flights, while B-1B Lancer bomber had entered Venezuelan airspace, including WC-130J surveillance aircraft, along with MB-22 Osprey support aircraft, which had taken off from a base in Puerto Rico. Despite U.S. bluster, President Nicolas Maduro warned Washington by Russian air defense systems. Every military in the world knows the power of IGLA-S, Maduro said. Venezuela has deployed at least 5,000 IGLA missiles at key air defense positions to ensure peace, stability, and the security of its people. In recent days, the Venezuelan military test-fired IGLA missiles at flare targets on Orquilla Island during military exercises. The large-scale exercises on the island involved the Marines, Navy, and military aviation.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has made a striking announcement regarding the country's defense capabilities. Speaking at a public event in Caracas, Maduro declared that Venezuela has deployed more than 5,000 Russian-made IGLA-S air defense systems across strategic locations nationwide. According to the president, these systems are in place to ensure the peace, stability, and tranquility of Venezuelan citizens, emphasizing that the country is prepared to defend its sovereignty against any external threat.
Every military force in the world is aware of the power of the IGLA-S, and Venezuela has deployed no fewer than 5,000 IGLA-S in key air defense positions to ensure the peace, stability, and tranquility of its people. More than 5,000. Those who understand, understand.
Maduro detailed the scope of the deployment, stating that thousands of trained operators are positioned in every mountain, village, and city across Venezuela. He described the arrangement as creating an impregnable homeland, warning that while Venezuela does not interfere in the affairs of other nations, it expects the same respect in return.
This simulation equipment puts us in a position for good aim with thousands of IGLA-S operators that we have in every mountain, every village, every city that you can imagine in Venezuelan territory, from north to south, from east to west, which must be an impregnable homeland. Let no one mess with Venezuela, because we don't mess with anyone.
This statement highlights a growing sense of assertiveness from Caracas, particularly in the context of rising tensions with the United States. The announcement comes against the backdrop of an intensifying US counter-narcotics campaign in the Caribbean and Pacific regions. Just days prior, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed that American forces had killed 5 alleged drug traffickers in strikes on vessels in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. These operations represent an expansion of previous actions, including at least 7 military strikes in the Caribbean that have already resulted in the deaths of over 30 individuals. The Trump administration has provided limited information about the evidence used to target these vessels, leaving Venezuela and its allies critical of US intervention. Maduro has repeatedly denied any Venezuelan involvement in drug trafficking, condemning the strikes as violations of national sovereignty. He warned that Caracas would not tolerate any acts that threaten the safety of its citizens, underlining the role of the IGLA-S systems as both a deterrent and a demonstration of defensive readiness. Russia's role in this development is particularly notable. The IGLA-S systems, which are man-portable, shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles, are produced in Russia and are known for their effectiveness against low-flying aircraft, drones, and helicopters. The sheer scale of this deployment, more than 5,000 systems, underscores a deepening military partnership between Venezuela and Moscow. Analysts suggest that this cooperation is part of a broader strategy by Russia to strengthen its influence in Latin America while providing strategic support to allied governments. From a geopolitical perspective, Maduro's announcement serves multiple purposes. It signals to domestic audiences that the government is capable of defending Venezuelan sovereignty. Internationally, it communicates a warning to the United States and its regional partners that Venezuela is prepared to respond to military pressure. The statement also underscores the broader context of Venezuela-Russia relations, which have included arms sales, energy cooperation, and mutual support against Western criticism.
Commander-in-Chief. We have been exercising, together with the political authorities, governors, and mayors who have also joined in to do a coastal defense exercise.
Venezuela preparing to hold their
A
ground.
coastal defense exercise. So the Strategic Operational Commander, last night, at midnight, after receiving instructions, if you will, from all commanders at all levels, the process was implemented. Specifically for this exercise of Independence 200 for the defense of the Bolivarian coast in these 9 states, in these 73 points so that we can put it into practice. So, from here, we humbly say that all the actions we are taking are, I repeat, to reach an optimal point to avoid and counteract the military threat deployed in the Caribbean, a gross military threat against the region, and also to protect the country internally from any act of destabilization. And we are going to do it with great force. The Bolivarian National Guard has been giving instructions at the citizen service points. We have to be a little more rigorous, more rigorous. 9 states. Our commander-in-chief is practicing a permanent offensive and exercising the national military muscle, making quick decisions and assuming the rapid deployment of resources and forces in 9 states from Zulia through Falcon, Carabobo, Aragua, Miranda, La Guaira, Anzoátegui, Nueva, especially part of Sucre. The state of Sucre is also implicit there with 73 points in those 9 states, 70 identified. Well, prior planning. Well, my commander, we have planned 9 points for today. No attempt to destabilize the Venezuelan nation will pass through here. They will be able to put I don't know how many bodies attached to the CIA in covert operations from any flank of the nation, and any attempt will fail as they have failed until now. Always in active resistance and permanent offensive. Perfect popular, military and police fusion, as ordered by our Commander-in-Chief Nicolas Maduro Moros. To provide peace, tranquility to our people. Demonstration. This immediate deployment that our President Nicolas Maduro has made together with the glorious Bolivarian army, who precisely in these days recommended Ho Chi Minh's strategic thinking.
Well, war with Venezuela seems inevitable at this point. Even President Trump yesterday admitted that another war is coming soon. He seemed excited about it. Meanwhile, this morning, another Venezuelan boat was just destroyed. Libs of TikTok just posted this, boasting, Trump just smoked another drug boat. Cry harder, Libs. This is exactly what I voted for. Did you vote for indiscriminate killing of people in a foreign country with no proof other than what the trust me bro intel agencies are telling you? Okay. Senator Rand Paul is not buying this bullshit. He says, by the way, they don't even make fentanyl, and we're falling for it. Watch.
We have dangerous people in a lot of American cities, but we just don't go in and shoot them. I mean, we have trials, they get legal representation. And even on the high seas, it's been that way for generations. If you go off the coast of Miami, the Coast Guard will be stopping boats today. And about 25% of the boats that they stop, that they're suspicious of drugs, there won't be any drugs on board. So 25% of the time, the suspicion is wrong. And that's why we don't shoot and just blow up boats off of Miami, but neither should we be blowing them up off the coast of Venezuela. Number one, there is no fentanyl made in Venezuela. Not just a little bit, there's none being made in Venezuela. These are outboard boats that, in order for them to get to Miami, would have to stop and refuel 20 times. They're in all likely going to Trinidad and Tobago, which is an island right off of the coast of Venezuela. So there's a lot of reasons to be worried about this. But number one is the broader principle of when can you kill people indiscriminately? When you're at war. That's why when we declare war, it's supposed to be done by Congress. It's supposed to be thoughtful. It's supposed to be debated. And we're not supposed to do it willy-nilly. And then when you have war, you just kill people in the war zone. And even then there are rules of engagement. But interdicting drugs has always been a criminal activity and a criminal anti-crime sort of activity where we don't just summarily execute people, we actually present evidence and convict them.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us again here on the show to talk about this. Colonel, I know I saw you the other day saying that we're making very little drugs at all. And why aren't we focused on Colombia, Honduras, Mexico, other places in the world, far more of a threat to the United States? It sounds like, Colonel, they really are manufacturing consent for war, and all of these like conservative influencer accounts are falling for it.
Well, everything that Senator Paul said is obviously true, and since 1965 has been consistently ignored. This looks a lot like the run-up to Vietnam, only in some ways worse. There's no clear, unambiguous mission in the sense of you are going to employ military power. What is the purpose? It's not clear. Stop drug manufacturing, illicit drug trafficking, human trafficking. It's unclear what we're actually trying to do in Venezuela. Now, we do have a president in waiting, I guess, in the form of this woman, Machado, who is periodically appealing on television to people to support us, I guess. She's certainly unwilling to condemn what we're doing at sea. But the bottom line is it's not clear. We're going to go down there and punish these people for the drug business. You know, that's not a mission for the military. What happens when you go in? What is this going to look like when we're through? This looks like another Vietnam episode. Our goal is to get the army into Vietnam. That was the goal in 1965. By the way, that was the goal in 2003 in Iraq. It's to get the army into Iraq. Well, I guess the goal is now to get the U.S. Army into Venezuela. The question is to do what? The other thing that no one is asking right now is what's the broader impact in the region? Today, President Trump made it sound as though we're going to go to war with Colombia as well. And Colombia and Ecuador are prime producers of cocaine, heroin, and these other things. We know that. But the bottom line does going down to this part of the world, is this going to solve our drug problem inside the United States? And what are the repercussions? What are the drug cartels going to do in Mexico, which is an organized crime state? Aren't they going to be allied with the Venezuelans and the people in Colombia? What's the rest of Latin America likely to do? I mean, we're not very popular in Latin America anyway. And wherever we go, we're never usually liked or welcomed. We're going to go in there and kill a lot of people, and we're going to become a rallying point for everybody in Latin America that wants to kill Americans. I just don't see any point to it. But perhaps President Trump thinks that this is payback for Venezuela's role in the software, Dominion software or something during his failed reelection in 2020. I don't know. But I don't see any tangible, concrete, strategic interest that justifies war with Venezuela or anybody else down there. I think we should have 50, 60,000 troops on the border with Mexico. That's for damn sure. And we should get control of the thing inside the United States. I would have much harsher penalties for drug and human trafficking in the United States. That would help us enormously, but not what we're doing in Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, well, this is just my opinion, but it feels like many people are falling for this idea that all of the drugs in the United States are coming from Venezuela, and therefore we need to go there and we need to invade this country, which is just not true at all, when it really is giving cover to all the massive amounts of natural resources that Venezuela has. It's oil and gold and emeralds and everything else that's sitting inside that country that we would love to have our hands on. They see the relationship that Venezuela is making with China. So to me, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, this seems like it's all about
Bunch of pirates.
Their natural resources, and we would love to get our grubby little hands on it.
Well, I'm sure you and Natalie listened to President Trump explain to everyone that he had, in fact, received an offer from Maduro in Venezuela. And Maduro, apparently, in his words, had offered him everything. In other words, a stake in the oil and gas industries.
It was a lie.
Effectively, Trump insisted pretty much anything that President Trump wanted. Well, why not take the deal? What's wrong with that? Do you want to administer Venezuela? 27 million people, a place the size of Germany and France combined. This is a disaster waiting to happen. You want to go down there and administer the place, replace the police, the military? What are you, crazy? This is the dumbest idea since 1965. This makes Iraq look like a cakewalk.
You know, I interviewed Colonel, I'll get you out of here on this. I interviewed Jordan Godreau a few weeks ago here on the show. Pretty eye-opening interview. He was really hung out to dry by the Trump administration. Mike Pence specifically, Mike Pompeo specifically. He was brought into the White House, given the task of leading a regime change during the first Trump administration. The CIA intervened, and many of his men died on the ground in Venezuela when the CIA stepped in and scuttled that project. So you had the Trump administration basically pushing for a regime change during the first Trump administration. CIA stepped in to stop it. Anyway, what do you make of that and the CIA's involvement here?
Well, I think in President Trump's mind, he's determined to avoid a Bay of Pigs scenario. If you go back and look at the operation into Cuba in 1962, 63, the efforts to assassinate Castro and then land these people in the Bay of Pigs, it all failed because the U.S. military power was inadequate and would not engage. I think in his mind, he is saying, this is going to work because I'm going to commit enough military power to make it successful. Well, Cuba is relatively small and minuscule compared to Venezuela. This is a huge place. It has 1,380 miles of border with Colombia, 1,380 miles of border with Brazil. You've got hundreds of thousands of paramilitary forces in Brazil and Colombia and probably Ecuador, all of which would eagerly crowd into Venezuela to fight us. And Venezuela is unmanageable from our standpoint. We don't have enough troops to put into the place to gain control of it. But he's not thinking in those terms. I think he's listening to people say, oh, this will be easy. These people won't fight hard. They don't like Maduro. Well, they may not like Maduro, but these people are proud of their country. They're proud of Venezuelan independence, and they will fight us. Question is, why do we want to fight them, especially if the man in charge has said, I'll do a deal with you? There's something more going on here with President Trump, because normally he's very happy to take a deal, and he refused it.
Yeah, something fishy is going on here. Colonel, always great to see you. I encourage our viewers to go over visit his website, The National Conversation.
Cocaine trafficking. Why is it that the Trump administration is threatening war against these three Christian countries who are deeply religious and deeply patriotic? They love the Second Amendment. And at the same time, we are supporting and arming the country that spits on Christians and disrespects Christians each and every day and bombs women and children in Gaza each and every day. Why is our Christian president doing this? President Trump is now threatening all-out war against Venezuela, Colombia. He has airstriked Colombian fishermen. He has airstriked fishermen from Trinidad and Tobago. He is also now threatening economic war against Nicaragua, you know, the poorest of these three countries, Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, axes of resistance of Latin America, if you will, the anti-imperialist sovereign nations of Latin America. And I think Trump just wants to turn all these countries into Argentina. He wants to crash all their economies. He wants to make sure that they're all permanently indebted for the rest of history to the IMF. I think this is really the goal here. I think he wants to steal their raw resources, which is really incredible because at the start of the Trump administration, he sent Rick Grenell to Venezuela, to Caracas, to meet with President Maduro. And in effect, in doing so, through that diplomatic move, he legitimized and recognized the presidency of Nicolas Maduro, which was an aberration from the Biden era policy in which the Biden administration said, we do not recognize the presidency of Nicolas Maduro. So Trump started off really good on Venezuela.
Chevron was a big-time donor of the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign for president. I think they even were like a major funder of his inauguration, the oil company Chevron. And at the start of the Trump administration, Chevron was allowed to skirt certain U.S. restrictions on actually operating oil fields in Venezuela. Venezuela said, look, United States, anyone, UK, if you want to do business with us and it's going to be fair business, we are happy to do business. We don't care who is doing business with us, so long as you are not stealing our resources for pennies on the dollar, right? That's the whole reason why Venezuela and Russia, China, all these countries are opposed to what the U.S. is doing, because we see what you're doing. Regime change, balkanization, all-out war, genocide, stealing resources, indebting these countries to the IMF, to the World Bank. This is the system of super imperialism that is opposed by many nations in the world. But if you will be an administration that will, I guess, move away from that sort of mindset and that approach to global politics and foreign mutual relations with different countries, and you will engage with certain nations in a mutually respectful manner, then okay. Now, it seems as though Marco Rubio has really sunk his teeth into Donald Trump. He has forced Rick Grenell out of this administration, in effect. He has forced Steve Witkoff, who I really don't have a lot of nice things to say about, but Steve Witkoff was at least, he was pretty reasonable when it came to Latin America. He has forced these individuals out of the administration, out of the State Department apparatus, and taken over full control. And Marco Rubio, by the way, his family made a lot of wealth in Miami several decades ago off of running a $75 million per annum cocaine trafficking business in the house that Marco Rubio was living in Miami. Marco Rubio is dead set and has been dead set on pushing for regime change in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Colombia. Well, not previously Colombia, because it used to be the Israel of Latin America, but now also in Colombia for his entire career. And it seems as though he's very close to getting that, because right now the United States has 8 U.S. warships carrying over 1,200 missiles, along with a nuclear submarine, and many fighter jets, many attack helicopters stationed just off the coast of Venezuela. Okay, they're also amassing a huge troop presence in Puerto Rico. This is all aimed at targeting Venezuela, but now also, I guess, Colombia, because Colombia has come into the crosshairs of these threats of war against Latin America, against sovereign countries in Latin America. So since early October, the Trump administration has killed over 30 individuals in quote-unquote anti-drug operations in the Caribbean. Now, Trump claims that he was targeting Venezuelan narco traffickers, but the truth is much different than that. The truth is that actually, first of all, these people were not narco traffickers. Second of all, a lot of these people were not even Venezuelan citizens. We saw that just this week, Trump airstriked a fishing boat which had citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And now the government of Trinidad and Tobago has responded. They've condemned this. Caribbean people are denouncing the extrajudicial killings of these fishermen in the Caribbean. And they are defending Venezuela's sovereignty in the midst of it all. So this is really crazy. Also, Colombian fishermen have been targeted. We'll touch on that in a second. Now, the U.S. has escalated this round of threats and attacks over this past week by flying B-52 bombers in Venezuelan airspace. So they've already violated the territorial waters and the sovereign airspace of Venezuela, but this time with B-52 bombers, I mean, that is a massive escalation. Of course, at any given moment, Venezuelan military personnel who are monitoring and monitoring the airspace and manning these air defense systems. I mean, they are thinking to themselves at that moment, these might be my last minutes on Earth as B-52 bombers enter the Venezuelan airspace, okay? Now, it is unclear as to whether or not the Trump administration is considering decapitation strikes. The B-52 bombers would indicate something like that. Decapitation strikes on the Maduro government. So that would, that would include people like President Maduro and his wife. That would include people like Diosdado Cabello, the leader of PSUV, the political party that President Maduro represents. That would include the chairman of the National Assembly in Venezuela. That would include Ivan Gil, the foreign minister of Venezuela. I mean, they would take out the entire government of Venezuela in these decapitation strikes if they could and if they wanted to, I guess. Whether or not they have the capability to do that is unclear. Venezuela has pretty strong air defenses, not as strong as some countries, but, they've been supported by Russia. In the past, in 2019, there was talk of a war on Venezuela, and it got very close to that. And Russia provided a lot of military support to Venezuela back then. But also, there is the threat of an amphibious landing on Venezuela and an actual invasion with troops on the ground in Venezuela. And I don't know if you guys caught it, but this week, J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth were at the U.S. Marine Corps base, Camp Pendleton, a place that I know very well because I've spent much time there. I grew up in San Clemente, which is about 25 minutes away from Camp Pendleton. And they were there and they were overseeing mock drills of amphibious landings on beach sides in California, Southern California, at Camp Pendleton. So it seems as though they are deploying a, method of strategic ambiguity as to how they're actually going to approach this issue if they, in fact, do decide to launch a war on Venezuela, okay? Now, it got even crazier when today Lindsey Graham was on Sean Hannity's show on Fox News. The neocons all got together for a joint conversation, and Hannity suggested that if the U.S. can bring a Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, to power in Venezuela, U.S.-backed, Israeli-backed opposition leader in Venezuela, the oil-rich country could become the 51st state of the United States. Take a listen.
I had a chat with you this weekend, and I thought you had a pretty darn good idea. And you said you were going to share it with the president. I want to know if you did. And that is this opposition leader in Venezuela that won the Nobel Prize that said it really deserved to go to Donald Trump. Sounds like a pretty good leader to me for the people of Venezuela and the end of narco-terrorism and a better relationship with the U.S. Or if they choose maybe the 51st state, I don't know.
Sounds good to me. But the opposition.
I had a chat with you this weekend, and I thought.
Now, in this clip, this guy's some senator or something. I don't know who he is, but I mean, they were talking about also deposing Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who recently had his U.S. visa revoked while he was at the United Nations in Manhattan. And he gave a speech outside the United Nations demanding U.S. military personnel to consciously object to war crimes in Gaza and the broader Middle East. So things are really heating up. The American people, though, have spoken, and they overwhelmingly reject any sort of military campaign on Venezuela. In fact, the most recent polls are pretty damning for the Trump administration. A YouGov poll has found that only 16% of Americans support a U.S. invasion of Venezuela, with 62% rejecting the idea. So I don't know what Trump's goal is here. I don't know. We have, the JFK files haven't been released. Epstein files haven't been released. The Gaza ceasefire is collapsing. No peace with Russia. And apparently, to make the situation better, apparently, Trump's great idea is, well, I will boost my poll numbers by doing something that, most Americans don't even understand how absolutely chaotic and dangerous would actually be if we decided to do it. But already, despite that, only 16% of Americans support, which is military action against Venezuela. 62% of Americans reject the idea, and with good reason. I mean, Venezuela is not your enemy if you're an American citizen. Venezuela is a God-fearing country. They are deeply Christian. Venezuela is a sovereign country that said they don't want their toes stepped on by any foreign outside powers. Venezuela is a country that stands with Palestine, with which the overwhelming majority of Americans, young Americans in particular, also stand with. Venezuela is a pro-Second Amendment country, as we refer to this in America. They have a people's militia of over 1 million people. Venezuela does not embody this woke agenda that was embodied and was deeply unpopular in the Biden administration. Venezuela is not your enemy, okay? Venezuela is the enemy of BlackRock. Venezuela is the enemy of the IMF, the World Bank, of Larry Fink, of Bill Gates, of Jeff Bezos, but he is not your enemy if you are an average American citizen. If you are an American citizen, you have more in common with working class people in Venezuela than you do anyone who represents you in the United States Congress, in the Senate, or in the White House, okay? So this is deeply unpopular. Venezuela is having to prepare for this now because it is a real threat. They have instituted Independence Plan 200 with the mobilization of air defenses across the coastal region of the country. And not only that, but their air defense systems are active. As you can see here, this is a military airport in Caracas, which I have been just outside of. I've not been inside of there, but I've been just outside of it. And there you see it again. This is in the road to Caracas. So from the beach side, from the airport to Caracas, they have a bunch of anti-tank infrastructure set up. This would, it would be extremely difficult for the United States to do a ground invasion of Venezuela simply due to the terrain. Caracas is a city that is completely surrounded on all sides by giant mountains, and it would be very difficult for the U.S. to, and it's far from the coastline, not too far, but kind of far. It would be very difficult for the U.S. to do a ground invasion. I'm not saying it'd be impossible, but it would be very costly. It'd be very costly in terms of equipment loss and also in terms of loss of human life. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these strikes on quote unquote Venezuelan narco traffickers have actually resulted in strikes on innocent fishermen from Trinidad and Tobago, as well as innocent fishermen from Colombia. The Colombian president has condemned this, and he's basically said, this is an act of war, which is true. I mean, you're targeting, you're killing civilians of a sovereign nation under the guise of anti-drug operations. It's insane. Donald Trump has now also threatened to invade Colombia over President Gustavo Petro's opposition to his attacks on Venezuela, which killed Colombian civilians. Now, these Colombian civilians who survived some of these attacks were actually repatriated back to Colombia because the U.S. they would be very, legally difficult situation if they decided to take these Colombian fishermen to the United States and try to prosecute them, because what crimes would they be prosecuting them for? They don't have any crimes that they've committed. So the United States repatriated them to what country? Venezuela, because they're allegedly Venezuelan narco traffickers? No, to Colombia, because they're Colombian fishermen. Okay. So yes, now we are apparently going to also potentially have war with Colombia. President Gustavo Petro of Colombia is an illegal drug dealer, strongly encouraging the massive production of drugs in big and small fields all over Colombia. Petro, a low-rated and very unpopular leader with a fresh mouth toward America, better close up these killing fields immediately, or the United States will close them up for him, and it won't be done nicely. So this guy's just living in a post-truth reality. He's going to nuke his own administration. The Colombian president has been very clear. He said this is a war for oil and it must be stopped by the world. The aggression is against all of Latin America and the Caribbean. We also had the Brazilian president, President Lula, who is much closer with the United States, at least until the past few months when this tariff war began. He came out and also backed Venezuela and Colombia. He said, everyone says we'll turn Brazil into Venezuela. Brazil will never be Venezuela, and Venezuela will never be Brazil. Each of us will be ourselves. Okay. He also said that Cuba is not a country of terrorists, but an example of a people with a sense of self-worth. Okay. So it looks as though Trump is now potentially going to wage war against every single sovereign country in Latin America. I don't think this is going to go well. This is all about resources. This is all about control. It's all about reigniting the Teddy Roosevelt, this American policy of control over all of the Americas. And I have to ask the question, why? Venezuela's national heroes, Colombia's national heroes. I mean, these are men who actually fought in the American Revolution. The Colombian people, the Venezuelan people, the Nicaraguan people, they are deeply patriotic people. Colombia responded to these threats of an invasion and regime change by recalling their ambassador to the United States, which is appropriate, especially after the airstrikes on their sovereign citizens who did nothing wrong. And to top it all off, Trump is also now considering new tariffs on restricting Nicaragua's benefits under the CAFTA DR Free Trade Pact due to quote unquote human rights abuses, labor rights violations. A socialist country has labor rights violations. It's amazing what they're, this must be the same people that wrote the Charlie Kirk, Tyler Robinson text messages, and dismantling the rule of law with proposals including tariffs up to 100% on imports or selective product measures. So you like your Nicaraguan coffee, your Venezuelan coffee, or Colombian coffee, you're going to be paying a premium in the near future in all likelihood. Benjamin Rubenstein tweeted about these tariff threats, and he said, Trump and Marco Rubio are preparing to wage economic war on Nicaragua. Nicaragua is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. The people of Nicaragua are deeply religious Christians. This will hurt them the most. Nicaraguans rank themselves as some of the happiest people in the world. They grow 97% of the food they eat. Same with Venezuela. They grow 100% of the food they eat. Public school is free. Hospitals free. I'd also imagine transportation free, healthcare free, education free. They just want to live and work in peace. Yet the U.S. regime insists on attempting to ruin their lives. Same thing in Venezuela. So this is all extremely insane. I'm really, really disappointed in all of this. And again, the end goal is this right here. Argentina's peso has fallen to an all-time low against the U.S. dollar and has now collapsed 99.8% since 2009. This is the goal. Steal their resources, privatize their industry. Maria Corina Machado said as much in her conversation with Donald Trump Jr. this week. She said, the U.S., you'll be so rich. We'll privatize all our resources. You guys will make so much money. We'll privatize the oil, privatize the banks. This is what they want to do. And the end goal is indebt them to the IMF, indebt them to the World Bank, get them straddled to the dollar, and cause chaos and misery for the average people. Okay. I don't think it's going to be as easy as Donald Trump thinks it's going to be. Venezuela has a very strong military, strong special forces. They have a people's militia of 1 million plus strong people who are all armed to the teeth. The idea that this will somehow take place, a regime change operation, and it will go smoothly without absolute chaos taking place is absurd. And you literally have to have the lowest IQ out of any world leader on the planet to assume that this would go smoothly. But this is the goal. And, after visiting Venezuela, I just have to ask the question, why is it that the Trump administration, I've been there twice, by the way, and it's very nice. Why is it that the Trump administration is threatening war against these three Christian countries who are deeply religious and deeply patriotic? They love the Second Amendment. And at the same time, we are supporting and arming the country that spits on Christians and disrespects Christians each and every day and bombs women and children in Gaza each and every day. Why is our Christian president doing this?
All right, next question is from B.R. Duffy, who says this. Hi, Glenn. The situation in Venezuela. I remember you implying that the excuses the administration is using for military action there is disingenuous. In fact, I not only implied that, I actually said that in a show we devoted to this very topic, I think 2 or 3 days ago this week, about the obvious dangers of engineering regime change in Venezuela, which clearly is the purpose of what we're doing there. The question goes on, quote, if drugs are not the issue, and we just turned down an agreement with them for a large stake in their oil, mineral, and gold rights, along with them cutting ties with China and Russia, then what is going on? Do I have this right? Why are we in a military conflict with Venezuela? It's a good question. First of all, I would be skeptical about these reports, and they're emanating directly from Trump as well, that Maduro basically said, oh, anything you want, we'll give you to stay in power. Have all our oil, have all our minerals, whatever you want, just leave us alone. And Trump today, and I'm quoting him, he used a profanity to say it, said, Maduro gave us everything, he offered everything because, quote, he doesn't want to fuck with the United States. But Trump strongly implied that he rejected all those offers and he wants to take out Maduro, which was the policy of the first Trump administration. They just couldn't get it done. That was what led to the exit of John Bolton, was he promised Trump it could be done with relative ease, and it didn't happen, and Trump lost faith in Bolton. And now we're right back to that. I saw the leader of the Venezuelan opposition, who she just won the Nobel Peace Prize. She said a couple things today. One is she called Benjamin Netanyahu to make clear that she is a strong, close friend of an ally of Israel, which is what you would expect. This is a neoconservative policy to topple regimes we don't like under the guise of spreading democracy and freedom, liberating the people of other countries, all the things I thought the America First movement was anathema to doing. So she said that, but then she also said, if you bring democracy and freedom back to Venezuela, you're not going to just bring it back to Venezuela, you're going to bring it back to the whole region. You'll topple the regimes of Cuba and other repressive regimes in the Caribbean and Central America and South America, and freedom and democracy will spread everywhere throughout the region. Which is exactly what neocons, of course, said in the build-up to the Iraq War, 2002, 2003, that if, and this is something Benjamin Netanyahu said, this was his main argument for trying to get the Congress to invade Iraq, which is he said, I can guarantee you that if you take out Saddam and a democracy flourishes there, it will spread, democracy will, to every country in the region. Obviously, that never happened. None of that came close to happening. The opposite happened. The United States has been trying to overthrow the government of Cuba for almost 70 years now. Our obsession with Cuba is what led to the Bay of Pigs disaster. It's what led to the Cuban Missile Crisis that came close to ending humanity as a species on this planet through nuclear apocalypse. This obsession with Cuba, why? It's a tiny little island. It's not a threat to the United States. Huge numbers of people came from Cuba to the United States. They exercise a lot of political power. They live in Miami. Marco Rubio's family is among them. And because they came from Cuba, they've always focused on Cuba, even though they're supposedly living in the United States as citizens of the United States. I grew up there. I grew up around them. I grew up in Miami, in South Florida. I know the Cuban community very well. In fact, a lot of them would come to the United States and live their whole lives here, and they would never learn English because they always thought they were just temporarily here until they were waiting for the United States to overthrow Castro, and then they were going to go back to Cuba. So why would they need to learn English? And the second, third generation Cubans have become more Americanized. They're sort of like Marco Rubio. They're higher, they go to college, they learn English, they become more Americanized, but still their interest remains very much focused on the Caribbean, Central America, South America. They hated Hugo Chavez as an ally. They don't just hate the communist government of Cuba, they hate whoever is an ally of his. And Marco Rubio is somebody who, although he was born in the United States, his parents are immigrants who came from Cuba. They didn't flee Castro, by the way. They fled the U.S.-supported government of Batista, who Castro overthrew. That story has gotten a little bit blurred over the years. I believe that's true about Rubio. I might be thinking about Ted Cruz, but I'm pretty sure it's true of Marco Rubio. And a lot of people, it's just like Israel, a lot of people who are raised in the United States, but told to love Israel, to think about Israel, want to use the United States government and their U.S. citizenship to serve the interests of this foreign country that they've been taught to love. And the same is true for a lot of people who come from Cuba, who come from Venezuela, who come from Latin America. There's a huge Venezuelan and Cuban voting bloc in Florida now. And a lot of those people, it's just like those Iraqi exiles who were so eager to have the U.S. overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime so they could feel like they and people aligned with them got back into power in Iraq. They used the United States as their private militia. You can find all sorts of Iranian dissidents or exiles or immigrants who think the United States should overthrow the current government of Iran and reinstall the Shah and the Shah's son, the Pahlavi family, the royal family of Iran. There's all kinds of people with interest in other parts of the world, with other countries, who come to the United States and want to use the United States to advance the interest of these other countries. And of course, they can talk reasons why it's somehow in the interest of the United States to do so. The reason that I say drugs are a pretext is because we've gone over these government reports several times now about where drugs come from that are entering the United States. And for many of the drugs that have been the topic of the most amount of concern and focus that are killing the most Americans, like fentanyl or opioids in general, they don't come from Venezuela. Venezuela has basically no role in the flow of fentanyl or other opioids into the United States, heroin. And even with the drug that they're most associated with, which is cocaine, very few drugs emanate from Venezuela. Very few drugs that come to the United States emanate from Venezuela. It comes from Colombia, it comes from Mexico, it comes from China. And even if you decided, we have to start interdicting drugs from Venezuela, why do you have to blow up boats? Just yesterday, we blew up another boat. I think it was the 6th boat in the last 6 weeks that we were told has drugs on it and drug traffickers on it. There have been families, including Trinidadian families, who have come and said, my son was on one of these boats. He was nothing but a fisherman. And you can say, well, am I supposed to blindly believe that person or their family? No, but you're going to blindly believe the government when they say the people they're blowing up are drug traffickers coming to the United States with no evidence? But yesterday we blew one up, and apparently not everybody aboard was killed. There were 2 or 3 survivors, and American helicopters swept down and picked them up and now have them in custody. So why can't we just do that? Why can't we just interdict boats that we claim are coming to the United States to smuggle drugs, charge them with crimes, put them on trial in a court, show the evidence that they're guilty, and then imprison them? That's how civilized countries punish drug trafficking, punish crimes. You don't just go around blowing boats up. And you can say, it's expensive to put people on trial. Do you know how much more expensive it is to do what we're doing in Venezuela? We have this gigantic military deployment, all kinds of aircraft carriers and submarines and drones. I mean, just the entire array of American military assets surrounding Venezuela deployed in the Caribbean. And we have a covert CIA program operating in Venezuela to destabilize and then overthrow the Maduro government, which is obviously very, very expensive as well. I'm sure we're throwing cash around that country. We have $100 million or something reward for the capture of Maduro. And then if we do succeed in installing this woman as the president of Venezuela and her faction, we're going to fund them. We're going to give her all sorts of weapons, give her the guns to fight the people in Venezuela who are still loyal to Maduro. And then whatever instability is going to occur, and of course there's going to be instability from a regime change war, we're going to pay for all that as well. So whatever costs come from interdicting these boats and picking these people up and prosecuting them and putting them in prison is a tiny, minute fraction of whatever we're going to spend and already spending on what is obviously a regime change war. And the question is why? Why do people in Ohio? Why do people in Arizona? Why do people in Idaho? How are their lives bettered by changing the government of Venezuela or the government of Cuba? How are people in Missouri or in Georgia harmed by having this government instead of that one in Havana or Caracas or other places in the Caribbean or in Central America? Their lives are as affected by that as they are affected by who runs various provinces of eastern Ukraine, which is to say not at all. This is pure neoconservative policy being pushed by people who are both neocons like Marco Rubio, but also people who have a lot of loyalty and ancestry based in that region. They want Maduro gone for their own reasons. They want Castro gone for their own reasons, or Castro's descendants. And they use the United States to do it. And it's really, I find it, I guess, astonishing, even though maybe I shouldn't. But I've watched Americans now for 2.5 decades say, and not just leftists or liberals, but conservatives, MAGA, America First, all these political movements converging on this understanding that we have to stop fighting these endless wars. We have to stop pouring our resources into regime change operations in other countries and focus on our own country and our own communities and the people who live in them. Remember all that? And you look at the priorities of the Trump administration: bombing Yemen, bombing Iran, feeding Israel weapons and arms, threatening Hamas, we're going to go in, and if they don't stop this or they don't stop that. Obsessed with the war in Ukraine and Russia. President Trump spoke with President Putin yesterday, met with President Zelensky today. Credit to him for trying to end the war. I believe he's trying to do that, but look at all the priorities. Now we're engaged in a major regime change operation in Venezuela. For what? Why? How does this align with any of the interests of the American people that Donald Trump and his supporters have vowed they're going to dedicate themselves to? There are agendas served by that. None involving the forgotten man, as Donald Trump called the people he claimed to want to represent. And all of that is true if this operation goes as perfectly as it could possibly go. But as Tulsi Gabbard told Fox News in 2019 when condemning the first Trump administration's desire to regime change Venezuela, it rarely, if ever, does go according to plan. And you end up producing all sorts of consequences you don't want and don't anticipate, getting dragged in so many other ways. And that's almost certainly what's going to happen here. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at
For having me, Cyrus. I love your videos. And this is a great place to start because it's actually related to China. It's clear that the United States is waging a new Cold War. You can call it Cold War II, the second Cold War. And China is the main target of that. Russia is a target. And we see that with the proxy war in Ukraine, which is not simply a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between NATO and Russia, and the U.S. is the leader of NATO.
Right.
And in the case of this new Cold War, of course, Russia is the target, but the main target is China. And that's because, as Marco Rubio said in his Senate confirmation hearing, when he was appointed by the Senate, when he was nominated, Trump nominated him and the Senate appointed him as Secretary of State. And in that nomination hearing, confirmation hearing, Rubio said that China is the greatest threat the United States has ever faced, greater than was posed by the Soviet Union, ostensibly. And he said that China is a so-called threat not only militarily in terms of security, but also in terms of the economy, technology, everything. Of course, you and I would dispute this idea that China is a so-called threat. China has not fought a war since 1979, whereas the U.S. has been at war for our entire lifetimes, constantly, multiple wars every year. So China has no interest in war and conflict. But the U.S. sees China as a threat to its global dominance. The U.S. seeks hegemony, and China is the only country powerful enough to challenge U.S. hegemony, not only politically, not only economically, but especially technologically. You know, if you look around the world, if you travel, pretty much every country on earth uses U.S. technology from Silicon Valley, these big tech corporations, you know, the Magnificent Seven that drive the stock market and the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. China is really the only country that has large technological alternatives to these U.S. monopolies. So we're in this new Cold War. I've already established that. Latin America plays an important role in that because essentially the strategy of the U.S. is that the U.S. now recognizes that, you know, for instance, the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. That was a 20-year war. It knew it could not win. The U.S. also recognizes that the West Pacific, you know, what the U.S. calls the Indo-Pacific region, that the U.S. is trying to still maintain a heavy military presence in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. That's become a major area of conflict. You know, Africa is not as prioritized in this new Cold War. Europe, clearly the U.S. is trying to withdraw from Europe. This is why the Trump administration is telling Europe, security is your responsibility. The war in Ukraine is your responsibility. So the two main regions that the U.S. is focusing on are the Pacific, the West Pacific, and Latin America, or the Americas in general. You know, now Trump is not so jokingly talking about annexing Canada, making Canada the 51st state. He's talking about colonizing Greenland, and Latin America is another target in this new Cold War. And essentially the strategy of the U.S. empire, you know, this goes back to Zbigniew Brzezinski in the 1990s. The strategy is to consolidate U.S. hegemony over all of the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, and then to project U.S. power into the West Pacific in order to contain China. And of course, the U.S. has finite resources. So this is why certain regions like Europe and Africa are being deprioritized.
Right.
Now, in terms of Latin America, many countries in the region have pretty good relations with China. China is the largest trading partner of South America. And when you take all of Latin America together and you exclude Mexico, China is the largest trading partner. Obviously, Mexico is the neighbor of the U.S. and there's this free trade agreement, was called NAFTA. It's been renamed, but it's, you know, this agreement means that over 80% of Mexico's exports go to the U.S. It's also the same with Canada. So these are countries that economically are very deeply integrated. Mm-hmm. But if you go south of Mexico, China is the most important trading partner. And you look at a chart of trade, over time, China is becoming more and more important economically for Latin America, and the U.S. is becoming less important. We see this now in countries like Argentina, which currently has a very right-wing pro-U.S. leader, Javier Milei, who campaigned claiming that he was going to cut all relations with China. And then, of course, he entered office and realized, you know, China is Argentina's largest trading partner. You can't just cut off relations with your largest trading partner. So what we see now is that the Trump administration is doing two bailouts of $20 billion each for $40 billion in liquidity injection to Argentina. One is through a currency swap between the Federal Reserve and the Central Bank of Argentina. And now Scott Bessent, you know, who comes from a hedge fund background, he's trying to get private funds to inject this liquidity to give the dollars needed in Argentina to pay the bondholders. So as part of this, one of the conditions is Scott Bessent admitted in an interview that he's pressuring Argentina to cut off its ties with China. And we've seen this again and again and again throughout the region. And this also explains, this is one of the reasons that Venezuela is being targeted. Venezuela is one of the closest allies of China in the region. In fact, recently, President Xi had a meeting with President Maduro, and they upgraded their relations to an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership at the same level as Pakistan. And we know, obviously, that Pakistan and China are very close. Pakistan plays a key role in the Belt and Road Initiative, in the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Venezuela has become another very important partner of China, and especially because of the aggressive U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. Venezuela has not been able to export a lot of its oil to many countries, so China imports the majority of Venezuela's oil. So it's not just about Venezuela, not just about its oil. It's about this larger geopolitical strategy of cutting off Latin America from China and also Russia. You know, Russia doesn't have a lot of economic ties with Latin America, but it does have political ties, especially with Venezuela, another country that's very close to China and Russia and Iran. So, you know, all of the big U.S. boogeymen that the U.S. is trying to isolate, you know, Venezuela is kind of this perfect storm. And then you bring in the oil issue, right? So Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on earth. Now, a lot of that oil is very heavy crude. It needs a lot of processing, but it's not like the light sweet crude that, is where people are really going after, especially, in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. But, there's a lot of potential in Venezuela. This so-called Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, who has been funded by the U.S. government for many decades, since at least 2003, her organizations have been getting funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout. The co-founder of the NED, Alan Weinstein, admitted in the Washington Post that it was created in the Reagan administration to essentially to do what the CIA had done covertly, but instead to do it overtly. We know that the NED has funded, opposition groups trying to carry out coups and regime change operations in China and Russia and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba and all the countries targeted by the US for regime change, right? All the famous color revolutions like we saw in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014. We saw that in Venezuela in 2002 and 2014, 2017, 2019. And once again, it's happening now. Maria Corina Machado, she admitted in an interview in February with Donald Trump Jr. that she wants to take power, overthrow Maduro, and privatize all of the oil in Venezuela and sell it off to U.S. companies. U.S. companies used to actually control a lot of the oil in Venezuela, especially ExxonMobil and Shell. Well, Shell is not a U.S. company, but, these Western oil companies. And what happened is that in 1998, the people of Venezuela elected this left-wing nationalist leader, Hugo Chavez, who created what he called the Bolivarian Revolution. Now, sometimes people are confused about this. They're like, what does this have to do with Bolivia? Well, it's a reference to Simón Bolívar, who was the revolutionary general in the 19th century who created an army and who defeated the Spanish Empire and liberated several current countries, including Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia. Bolivia is named after Simón Bolívar. These were part of the Spanish Empire, right? And those modern countries, that they exist because of Bolívar's revolutionary war against the Spanish Empire. So essentially, Chavez was influenced by this legacy of Bolívar, and he declared the Bolivarian Revolution. And he declared there was a constitutional referendum that was voted on by the Venezuelan people. 3/5 voted to create a new constitution, very progressive constitution. It also changed the name of the country to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Everywhere you go, I've been to Venezuela several times. Everywhere you go, there are signs and murals of Simón Bolívar. He's just like this he's like the hero of South America.
Right.
So he also nationalized Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil and kicked out the U.S. oil corporations. So ever since then, the U.S. has been desperate to get back into Venezuela. In 2002, the George W. Bush administration backed a violent coup attempt in April 2002. Chavez was briefly overthrown, but he was so popular that the people of Venezuela flooded the streets and they demanded that he be returned. Now, a few things happened that also was very advantageous to Venezuela. Venezuela was one of the first countries in Latin America to really grow very close to China because, during the first Cold War, China did not have relations formally with almost any country in Latin America. Cuba, Nicaragua briefly, some left-wing governments, but, most of the governments in Latin America during the first Cold War were right-wing dictatorships backed by the U.S. Chile had the Pinochet dictatorship. There was Videla, the right-wing dictator in Argentina. They were all, this was known as Plan Condor or Operation Condor. This is where, the U.S. was like what it's trying to do now in the new Cold War, trying to impose its hegemony on the region. So after the first Cold War ended, China did establish relations with some countries. Trade started increasing. China, of course, was still economically not a significant exporter. It was a small economy. China has, of course, developed very rapidly. And now Latin America's relations with China have become more important. So for instance, if you look at all of the countries around the world, there are only 12 countries that refuse to establish formal relations with the People's Republic. There are only 12 countries that recognize Taiwan as a country, which according to international law, it is not a country. The United Nations and international law established that Taiwan is part of China. There's only one China. Hong Kong and Taiwan and Macau are part of China. Well, there are 12 countries that refuse to recognize that, and half of them are in Latin America. The most populous of these countries is actually Guatemala. It's still a very small country, but most of these countries that have relations with Taiwan are very small. Haiti, Guatemala, also Belize, and Paraguay. So these are small countries. And until recently, for instance, Honduras just formally established relations with China 2 years ago. Okay. So for some countries, especially in Central America, these are small countries. The U.S. has a lot of pressure on them. Politicians are also bribed. There's been a lot of reports, a president gets paid millions of dollars. That's a lot of money in Central America. So I'm not going to recognize China. I'm getting rich from, Taiwan there have been many reports that Taiwan has been, these Taiwanese authorities have been bribing these politicians and business leaders to keep relations. So relations between Latin America and China are still pretty new, but they're getting closer and closer. And Hugo Chavez in Venezuela was one of the first leaders who really embraced China. And of course, this was during the commodity boom, right? In the 2000s, China was growing at breakneck speed, over 10% GDP growth per year, massively industrializing, just building so much infrastructure and roads and apartment buildings. It needed tons of commodities. And Latin America became a major trading partner. Brazil is one of the world's leading producers of iron ore. Venezuela is a major oil producer. There are multiple major oil producers in Latin America and the Caribbean, including Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, increasingly, we've seen the Caribbean has become more important. And so what we've seen is that essentially, and during the commodity boom, Latin America was growing a lot along with China. But then a few things happened. You had the commodity crash, especially in 2014, 2016. Oil prices crashed. They've never really recovered. Then in 2015, the U.S. really started putting the pressure on Venezuela and started imposing heavy sanctions on Venezuela. It actually started under Obama. It didn't start with Trump. It was bipartisan. In 2015, Obama declared an absurd executive order that identified Venezuela as an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, which is complete nonsense. But the reason that Obama did that is with the executive order, like what we see Trump doing now. This is bipartisan. Then he could bypass Congress and start imposing sanctions on Venezuela. So the sanctions started in 2015. And then in 2017, when Trump came in to win a lot of the votes in Miami, right in Florida, and now Marco Rubio is his Secretary of State, he really tightened the screws on Venezuela, the noose around the neck. In fact, an official in the Trump administration famously said, he boasted that the sanctions on Venezuela were like Darth Vader's death grip. And they really tried to suffocate Venezuela economically. And this led to a horrible economic crisis. I was in Venezuela. I saw hyperinflation that makes, the inflation in Turkey look like nothing. And that's because, the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, this is a country that for 100 years has been a petrostate, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like the UAE. These are countries that they don't really have any industry. And basically, they just export commodities. And then everything in the economy relies on that. You have something known as Dutch disease or the resource curse. Their currencies tend to significantly appreciate because they get in all this hard currency that flows in from their current account surplus. And then that makes it very difficult to actually have competitive industry because all your other exports become so competitive. And then you just import food because everything's so cheap because your currency is so overvalued. Venezuela is a petrostate. It has been like that. And previously, there were elites in Venezuela and they benefited from the oil, but the vast majority of the population did not benefit. Chavez nationalized the oil and he used that money to build housing units for poor people, to fund education and healthcare and very high social services and strong programs. But it always depended on this constant influx of oil revenue. Right. So Venezuela was hit by these two huge boulders, these like sledgehammers of oil prices collapsing and then the U.S. sanctions. And then the sanctions escalated and escalated until 2019. Trump imposed a full-on economic embargo of Venezuela, like the embargo of Cuba. And then a big issue in Venezuela that I've seen firsthand is that because not only is Venezuela a petrostate, but also all of its infrastructure, all of its technology was built built by U.S. companies largely using U.S. technologies. So for instance, Chavez did nationalize the oil industry, but all of the actual technology used to get the oil out of the ground and then to refine the oil was U.S. companies building that technology, a few European companies, but Venezuela didn't actually have companies making the drilling equipment and all of the massive capital expenditure needed. They did nationalize the actual company that was doing the drilling and the refining. They had a U.S.-based refiner in Texas that was called Citgo, And you even in the southern U.S., they used to have some Citgo gas station that was actually a Venezuelan state-owned company.
Wow.
But when the U.S. began imposing sanctions on Venezuela, Venezuela could no longer repair and upgrade its equipment. So all of that capital expenditure, all the capital equipment, suddenly, over time, you have to keep investing and investing. Well, it starts breaking, and they don't have any of the parts and equipment they need because it was all imported from the U.S. And then there are other, like I mentioned, that Venezuela has very heavy crude, so they had to import light crude and other chemicals that they would need in order to mix it to refine the oil to use it. So the sanctions basically, what I often point out to people is people like to say, Venezuela, socialism, it's all failed. Well, I can say, no, look at what happened. Look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has tried for decades to modernize its economy, to diversify away from oil with very few successes. The UAE, the same thing. Imagine if suddenly the U.S. put heavy sanctions on them, blocked them from accessing the financial system, stole their foreign exchange reserves. In 2022, the U.S. and Europe stole $300 billion in euros worth of Russian assets belonging to the Russian central bank. This is an incredible act of international piracy that has also fueled de-dollarization in this massive bull market in gold. Now gold is $4,200 and increasing every day. A big reason for that is that they seize treasuries and euros, euro-denominated assets, largely sovereign bonds that belong to Russia. So all these central banks are diversifying. Well, actually, previously they did that to Venezuela in 2019. There are still $3 billion and counting worth of Venezuelan gold being held by the Bank of England. They refused to give that back. So imagine if Saudi Arabia had all of its reserves seized. They were blocked from accessing the international financial system. They couldn't get access to dollars. They would collapse almost immediately. It's really simple to explain. It's a petrostate that has been under the vice of these sanctions. What has been interesting in the past few years is actually their oil output has actually recovered quite a bit. It's still pretty low. It's half of what it was at its peak, but it's now over $1 million per day. 1 million barrels per day and increasing. And a big reason for that is what's interesting is a lot of the new technology being used in Venezuela's oil industry is not just coming from China and Russia. It's actually coming from Iran. Because, Iran is a country that's been under U.S. sanctions ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So Iran was forced as a major oil exporter, oil producer, it was forced to create its own technology. It's been doing this for decades. So Iran actually sent over a lot of technicians and technology to Venezuela to modernize and fix a lot of its oil infrastructure. So what we see is that Venezuela is really at the center of this new Cold War. It's a country that, yes, it has a left-wing government that is very anti-U.S. imperialism because, the U.S. has invaded almost every country in Latin America. The U.S., I spent a lot of time in Nicaragua. The U.S. literally militarily occupied Nicaragua from the 1910s, starting in 1912 until the 1930s. For 20 years, it was basically like a U.S. colony. Puerto Rico is still colonized by the U.S. We see, the U.S. had invaded Panama in 1989. The U.S. invaded Grenada in 1983. They're now threatening Venezuela. So it makes sense that a lot of these countries in the region, they see U.S. imperialism as the main threat to their national security, to their stability. Cuba's been under sanctions for over 60 years. So Venezuela is kind of like the big prize from the perspective of these imperial strategists in Washington. They just really want to overthrow it because of its very independent foreign policy, its support for China, Russia, Palestine, and also its oil reserves. And I mentioned that Maria Corina Machado, she admitted in this interview with Donald Trump Jr. that she wants to privatize all of that and sell it off to U.S. companies, which, that's one of the reasons why she won the Nobel Peace Prize. Because, Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then he bombed 7 countries: Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan. That's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize after millions of deaths in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and Bangladesh. He's the one who was one of the architects of the famous CIA coup in Chile in 1973. So, the Nobel Peace Prize is extremely hypocritical. And, if you look at U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, unfortunately, it's just a long history of interventionism and lack of respect for sovereignty.
Yeah, Ben, that is just a phenomenal answer. And I just absolutely Really enjoyed that history lesson, and I want to thank you for bringing, for the audience here, this incredible insights into, again, how this larger geopolitical story is at play. I would agree with you as far as this Nobel Peace Prize, that it seems to be a little bit more of a political angle here. And I think what's interesting here, Ben, is we're actually looking at a lot of U.S. Navy ships are now encroaching, closer and closer to Venezuela. I want to talk to that specifically. I mean, are we looking at potentially a flashpoint here where there could actually be a conflict between the United States and Venezuela? How are you looking at that situation? Do you think that we're looking at, America's next war potentially?
Well, there already is a conflict. Now, the question is whether or not it escalates further. I mean, there is a kind of low intensity war. Trump has officially said that he's at war, but he hasn't said with Venezuela. Instead, he said he's at war with drug traffickers, which is hilarious because if you know anything about Latin America, you know that Venezuela produces almost no drugs. Its neighbor, Colombia, is the world's largest producer of cocaine by far.
Right.
It's a joke. I mean, it's so funny. Anyway, and also in terms of drug trafficking, we know that the CIA has a long history, and the DEA, of being involved in drug trafficking in Latin America. This is not like some crazy conspiracy. This has been reported on by mainstream reputable journalists. Famously, Gary Webb was an American journalist who exposed in the 1980s during the Contra War, where, the dirty wars in Central America, where the CIA was supporting these death squads known as the Contras in Nicaragua, but also similar groups in Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala later as well. And there was a genocide against the indigenous community in Guatemala, carried out by a US-backed dictatorship. But anyway, during those wars, the CIA was using proceeds of trafficking cocaine and then using that money to fund the war in Central America. And then what happened with the cocaine, they flooded that cocaine into poor neighborhoods in the US, largely in Los Angeles, which fueled the crack cocaine epidemic in the US, which led to huge congressional hearings and a huge scandal in the 1980s.
Right.
This was exposed by the American journalist Gary Webb in his famous book, Dark Alliance. So, I mean, anyone in Latin America hearing the U.S. talk about that, it's a joke. In the case of Colombia, I mean, according to the United Nations, Colombia is responsible for the majority of cocaine production. And we know that there are multiple politicians in Colombia who have been deeply involved in the cocaine trafficking, And can you guess what their relationship is with the U.S.? They're all U.S. allies.
Right.
So the former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, a very powerful oligarch, the most powerful politician in the country. He was also a very close ally of the U.S., of George Bush. And he was one of the people leading the so-called war on drugs. I mean, these jokes write themselves. The same thing in Mexico. Felipe Calderón, the Mexican president, who was another close ally of Bush, he was the head of his security in Mexico was a drug trafficker. This has become a huge scandal. Garcia Luna is his name. It's become a huge scandal in Mexico, and he was the one leading the so-called war on drugs in Mexico. So in the case of Colombia, getting back to Venezuela as a neighbor, in the case of Colombia, according to the United Nations, the vast majority of cocaine is produced there, and yes, some of it does go through Venezuela, but if you actually want to stop the drug trade, you need to go to the source of the drugs, not just the countries that it transits through. By the way, where are these drugs going? These drugs are going to the US and Europe. You need to deal with the demand problem and not just the supply problem. As long as you have this constant demand for drugs, you will find people who will provide the supply. By the way, and in terms of the US obviously has major issues with drugs, but it's not cocaine really. It's fentanyl. It's synthetic opioids. And the reason this problem even exists is because of pharmaceutical companies, especially Purdue Pharma. We now know there have been dozens of class action lawsuits, including dozens of lawsuits filed by state governments and attorneys general, accusing the Sackler family that owned Purdue Pharma and ran Purdue Pharma of paying doctors to overprescribe OxyContin, which was produced by Purdue Pharma, which got all of these people addicted. And then after they could no longer get OxyContin from their insurance or from a doctor prescription, they would just start using heroin because their synthetic opioids are similar chemically to heroin. And where did that heroin come from? It came largely from Afghanistan. And, the Taliban, for the infinite many valid criticisms of the Taliban. I'm not a fan of the Taliban, but as soon as they took power after the US military left, suddenly heroin production collapsed in Afghanistan. So there's now there's a very good new book about this, which is called the Fort Bragg Cartel by Seth Harp, who's a U.S. military veteran who talks about the U.S. military's involvement in drug trafficking, including of heroin in Afghanistan. Anyway, getting back to Venezuela, it's a complete joke. Venezuela has nothing to do with the drug trade. This is the excuse being used to justify carrying out attacks on Venezuela. Now, I've already talked about why the U.S. is targeting Venezuela, but in the case of Venezuela, the accusation being made is completely baseless. What the Trump administration is claiming, starting in the first Trump administration, back in his first Justice Department, is they claimed that they filed charges in U.S. courts against the president of Venezuela, as if U.S. courts have jurisdiction over Venezuela. It's absolutely crazy. I don't know of any country on earth that claims that its own local courts have jurisdiction over foreign leaders and foreign countries. We saw the same thing happen with the U.S. and China, carrying out charges against like Chinese companies like Huawei. I mean, so we saw like the kidnapping basically of the CFO of Huawei in Canada based on accusations that Huawei was violating U.S. sanctions against Iran. Huawei is a Chinese company. They don't have to abide by U.S. sanctions. Well, in the case of Venezuela, the first Trump administration, they claimed that the president of Venezuela, Maduro, is the head of a drug cartel called the Sun Cartel, El Cartel de los Soles. Now, this does not exist. Many international experts on drugs, international experts, have investigated, they've done research. There's no such thing as the Cartel de los Soles. It was literally created by the U.S. in order to create this legal narrative that Maduro is not a legitimate president, but rather he is the head of a drug cartel, so they can justify intervening to overthrow him, like the 1989 invasion of Panama, when the U.S. invaded and overthrew and then imprisoned the leader of Panama, Manuel Noriega, who had been a longtime CIA asset, by the way. And he was involved in drug trafficking for the CIA. The situation in Venezuela has these similarities, but it's Maduro. There's no evidence that Maduro is involved in drug trafficking. International experts on drugs have looked into this. The UN has looked into this. It is a complete farce that is being used to justify military intervention. Now, Tren de Aragua does exist. Tren de Aragua is a real drug cartel that is horrible. They've carried out many crimes in Venezuela. And ironically, the Venezuelan authorities have cracked down on these cartels like Tren de Aragua. The strategy is to create this false link, like the false claim that Saddam Hussein was linked to Al-Qaeda, when in reality, Saddam Hussein had been cracking down on Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda didn't like Saddam Hussein because he was a relatively secular leader. I mean, he was a Sunni, and Iraq's a Shia majority country, but he was a relatively secular leader who had cracked down on Al-Qaeda. So after 9/11, the U.S. tried to create this false link between them, and there were polls done in the U.S., and the majority of Americans thought that Saddam Hussein was linked to Al-Qaeda, which is completely false and absurd. The same thing is now happening in Venezuela. The U.S. government has been trying to falsely link Maduro to Tren de Aragua through the creation of this false drug cartel, supposedly called the Cartel de los Soles. And if you look at the supposed members that the U.S. claims are the leaders of this so-called cartel, it's all of the leaders of the Venezuelan government. It's Maduro and all of his ministers. So, I mean, this is a strategy to justify a military intervention. And I'm really concerned about this. I really do think, I don't think the U.S. will send troops because that would be obviously very unpopular with the MAGA base. But I really think this is all escalating to carry out direct attacks in Venezuelan territory. The U.S. has already killed dozens of Venezuelans in international waters. And according to the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, who has condemned what's going on vociferously, Petro has claimed that Colombian nationals have been killed in these boats. And Trump claims without any evidence that supposedly they're trafficking drugs. There's no evidence of that. Ironically, a lot of these people are probably, undocumented immigrants trying to go into different countries. So they're being killed without charge or trial. Dozens of Venezuelans, but now there are reports by the Colombian government that Colombians have been killed. And recently, there have been reports of Caribbean people from citizens of Caribbean countries, who are also being killed now. And this is all escalating further. And one other quick note I have to say is that Marco Rubio is behind this. Trump, he doesn't like Maduro and he wants to get the oil and all this. In 2023 at a rally, Trump famously said, we came so close to taking over Venezuela, those were his language, and we would have gotten all that oil. That's what he said in a rally. You can find a video clip. But honestly, I don't think Trump is like the kind of main brains behind what's happening. This is 100% Marco Rubio. Rubio, for his entire career, has been obsessed with overthrowing Cuba, Nicaragua's Sandinista government, and then Venezuela, which is the cherry on top. Rubio is very close to the far-right forces that are calling for a U.S. military intervention. So Maria Corina Machado, who just won this Nobel Peace Prize, she literally is she's lobbying for the U.S. military to invade her country. It sounds like a joke, but the BBC interviewed her right after she won the Nobel Peace Prize. And in the interview, she called for the U.S. military to invade Venezuela, calling for war. And there are many different groups in the opposition in Venezuela. There are more moderate right-wing forces, like, for instance, Enrique Capriles, who was a former presidential candidate who ran against Chavez and also against Maduro, a right-wing conservative leader. He has criticized Maria Corina Machado for being an extremist. He literally called her an extremist. And he said she wants a war. She wants to do what happened to Libya to our country, because he and many other people have pointed out this could cause a civil war. If the U.S. military intervenes, if there's bombing of Caracas, if they try to kill Maduro, which they're talking about, Trump confirmed that he's authorized the CIA to carry out covert operations. If they kill Maduro, it could literally cause a civil war, like Iraq, like Libya. Libya, ever since 2011, NATO bombed Libya. There were no troops on the ground, but they killed Gaddafi. They destroyed the central government. Here we are, 14 years later. There's still no central government in Libya. Libya had been the country in and all the African continent with the highest standard of living, a major oil-rich country. It's a failed state. There's still a civil war going on. So I think this is very, very dangerous, what's happening in Venezuela, and we should follow very closely what's happening.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, what's been well documented, Ben, and I mean, you have hit on this history, which I think is so, profound, because you have an extensive knowledge in Latin America. This is really why I wanted to get you on the show here tonight, to discuss this, because this is the facts that, are not reported in mainstream media. And certainly the vast majority of American citizens really don't know a lot about this history. But as you've pointed out, with many case studies and many examples, is look at the United States history. I mean, we have a very, very deep history of intervening into many sovereign countries in Latin America, government coups, military operations. I mean, quite frankly, the United States government's actions in Latin America over the past, 100 years have been quite terrible. And I think this is why you're starting to see, like you mentioned, excluding Mexico, most of these countries are now shifting, towards China. You're starting to see a huge de-dollarization effort as well. If there is an event, this is the last question for this topic, specifically on Latin America and Venezuela. But in the event that this does escalate, let's imagine that a Trump does take out a Maduro. I mean, we don't want to see somebody assassinated and things like that. Of course, I'm certainly anti-war. And I mean, I think, like you said, this would cause a civil war. You give the example of Libya. I mean, that's a great case study where 14 years later, the country is in absolute disaster. And we've just seen this with the United States. There's very few examples where the United States gets involved in another country and it actually results in a positive outcome. We just typically don't ever see that from the United States. It actually typically ends up in more chaos and in a worse position than when it actually started. I mean, do you see that this could potentially be Latin America would then unite against the United States? Would they potentially move closer to a BRICS, closer to a China as a result, if the United States decides to escalate this to a point of a very big conflict?
Sadly, no. I wish I could say yes. I wish, but sadly, no. But of course, the answer is more complex than that. I'll get into the complexities. One, the region is very divided politically and also economically. And two, there's a lot of fear. And basically, the response is, it's similar to what's happening in West Asia, the Middle East, where a lot of countries have been afraid of standing up to the US and Israel because they don't want to be the next Palestine. They don't want to be the next Yemen. They don't want to be the next Iraq and Syria. In Iran. Iran is one of the only countries. So fear, there's also economic reasons. They don't want to lose trade. They don't want to be sanctioned by the US. In the case of Latin America, I mean, literally every country in Latin America, except French Guyana, which is an overseas French territory, like an old school French colony in South America, excluding French Guyana, the US military has intervened in every single country in the region, and many countries multiple times. I mentioned that within our lifetimes, the U.S. has invaded some countries like Grenada. Well, I wasn't alive when they invaded Grenada, but Grenada, Panama, and they're now carrying out these attacks and you're even talking about drone strikes in Mexico. I mean, so it's very real possibility that this, Panama also, Trump says we're taking over the Panama Canal. And then BlackRock tried to buy the ports on both sides of the Panama Canal, which were run by a Hong Kong company. Trump falsely claimed that the Panama Canal is run by China. It's not true.
Right.
But BlackRock announced they were going to buy these ports, and that deal has not really gone through. But the U.S. is very serious about this, and it scares a lot of countries in the region. So one, countries are afraid of military intervention. Two, countries are afraid of sanctions. And we've seen how sanctions devastate economies. And a lot of these countries still, even though China is their largest trading partner, they still do a lot of trade with the U.S. So China is the largest trading partner of South America, but the U.S. is the second biggest trading partner.
Correct.
So they really do not want sanctions. This is the thing about Cuba that a lot of people don't understand. Cuba's a small island nation. I mean, and they don't have much manufacturing. They relied largely on exporting commodities of things like sugar. I mean, the sanctions, the blockade in Cuba have been devastating because the U.S. was historically their largest trading partner. How are they supposed to trade with other countries, especially with secondary sanctions? What company is going to risk trading with, exporting to Cuba when they risk facing secondary sanctions by the U.S.? Then they get blocked from the financial system. They can't work with banks. As you know, I mean, anyone who's done business abroad, you have to often have a correspondent bank based in the U.S. in order to, like if you have a bank, let's say in Malaysia, and you want to do trade with someone in Brazil, well, your local banks, almost certainly their correspondent bank is in the U.S. Almost certainly. It'll go through the SWIFT system. And according to U.S. law, they say that all transactions that go through the SWIFT system that touch a U.S. correspondent bank technically touch U.S. territory, and scare quotes, according to U.S. law, which means that all of those banks have to abide by U.S. anti-sanctions and anti-money laundering laws and know your customer laws. So this means that no one is going to risk doing business with Cuba, even Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela does have a lot of oil and people want to buy its oil, but you can buy oil from any other country. So what happens is that a lot of countries and companies, they de-risk. They don't want to touch any sanctioned country. They don't want to touch Venezuela, Cuba, Iran. So a lot of these countries in the region, they're afraid of speaking out or standing up because they're like, okay, well, maybe if we just don't do anything, the U.S. will attack Venezuela, but we don't want to be the next Venezuela. And this is certainly the case in Colombia, but also Brazil. Brazil is a little different because it's the largest country in Latin America. It has over 200 million people. It's the largest economy in Latin America. It does have a pretty advanced manufacturing sector. It has a lot of oil and commodities. So Brazil is big enough that they can kind of pursue an independent path, which is why Brazil was one of the co-founders of BRICS.
Correct.
B in BRICS is Brazil. And actually the co-founder of BRICS was Lula da Silva. He's the only current leader who was one of the original co-founders, which was in 2009 when BRICS was founded as BRIC. And then in 2010, South Africa joined. It became BRICS. Since then, BRICS has expanded repeatedly. BRICS now represents the majority of the global population, and it's becoming very close to 1/2 of global GDP when you measure the GDP of BRICS members at purchasing power parity. There are now 10 members and 10 partner countries in BRICS. Every year they expand. And by the way, in Latin America, there's a lot of interest in joining BRICS. So Argentina, they had a previous, center-left government under Alberto Fernandez, and he accepted the invitation to join BRICS. That was in 2023. However, he lost that election, and this very right-wing pro-U.S. leader, Javier Milei, came in, who's a close ally of Trump. Argentina had accepted the invitation formally to join BRICS, and they would have joined on the 1st of January in 2024, but he withdrew Argentina before they joined BRICS. I mentioned all those factors of fear and the risk of sanctions. The other factor I mentioned is simply division. So there are the political divisions, and in Latin America, in Asia and Europe, it's not always as neat. In Europe, for instance, there are left-wing leaders who are very critical of the U.S. and NATO, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, or, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn in the U.K. But there are also some right-wing leaders, like Viktor Orban, who is much more critical of NATO and more sympathetic to China and Russia. And in Asia, it's more complex politically as well. But in Latin America, it's pretty simple. The left-wing leaders are critical of the U.S. and want better relations with China and Russia and BRICS. And the right-wing leaders are pretty much all very pro-U.S. because, they usually represent like certain importer sectors or certain commodities groups that export to the U.S. market, and they do all their trade with the U.S. That's kind of changing a little bit. Like in Chile, for instance, there was a right-wing president, Sebastián Piñera, a billionaire, who did a lot of trade with China. But for the most part, the right-wing leaders are very pro-U.S.
Right.
Javier Milei in Colombia, Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. They're all very pro-U.S. and anti-China. And in fact, China has become a political issue in elections in Latin America, kind of in the U.S., in the way that, U.S. politicians scapegoat China for everything, even though China has nothing to do with these problems. That's been happening in Latin America. So in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, he scapegoated China for all these problems. I mentioned that Javier Milei in the Argentine election, he said, I'm going to cut relations with communist China. Communist China is blah, they're so evil.
Right.
And then what happens is, he came into power and he realized, this is the largest trading partner. You have to be a little more balanced.
Diplomatic.
But
Yeah.
anyway, the point is that the left-wing leaders tend to be very pro-BRICS, very pro-China, and they want to join BRICS. But there are also divisions. So the last thing I'll say here is that Venezuela has been pushing to join BRICS for many years. And Venezuela officially applied to join BRICS. And at the 2024 BRICS summit that was held in Kazan, Russia, all of the BRICS members, except for one, agreed to allow Venezuela to join BRICS. It was actually Brazil that boycotted Venezuela's entry. So it shows that there are these internal divisions within the Latin American left, which also make unity more difficult, which means that when the U.S. is, threatening a country like Venezuela, it makes it less likely there will be this unity of defending them. So this is another reason why I think, it's the same thing that's happened in Africa for so long. Correct. So many African leaders have said, we need African unity, Pan-Africanism, but it's very difficult. You have all these divisions, and then what happens is that foreign powers can divide and conquer, and the lack of unity makes it more difficult to defend their sovereignty.
Yeah. Well said, Ben. Well, I want to thank you so much for that amazing insights into Latin America and really, again, the history lesson, the context, the nuances that we need to understand that. We're going to continue to keep watching the situation because I agree with you. I also
in a neighborhood to go after a couple of boats. Yeah. This is about regime change, which, by the way, I think is potentially.
He's admitting it. So the guy who was the head of the Council on Foreign Relations is saying this is about regime change. So you know how Trump is going to overthrow Venezuela so we could steal their oil? That's why they've been sanctioning Venezuela and giving $40 billion to Argentina. Argentina is supposed to be a great capitalist society, yet they need a bailout from the United States. Whereas Venezuela, Cuba, we've been sanctioning the hell out of them, and somehow their countries keep moving right along. So now Trump's going to have to overthrow Venezuela because Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia. Just FYI. So now they've been bombing these fishing boats, and they claim they're running drugs. Well, if they're really running drugs, what you're supposed to do is the Coast Guard is supposed to grab them and you put them on trial. That's what you do with drug runners. But what they've been doing is just bombing them. In fact, now they claim there was a submarine. And so they bombed a submarine, but 2 people survived. And it's funny, the 2 people that survived, they didn't arrest them and put them on trial. They just released them and sent them back to their home country. Isn't that weird? Here it is right here from the New York Times. The Trump administration has decided to repatriate. That means send the people back to their country. 2 survivors of a deadly U.S. strike on a suspected drug runners in the Caribbean Sea rather than prosecute or hold them in military detention. Why wouldn't you want to just send them to Guantanamo? Why wouldn't you want to hold them in military detention? Why would you let these drug runners go back to their country so they could do more drug running? Oh, I know, because it's not about drug running. It's about overthrowing and doing another regime change in a country that has natural resources we want to steal. And it's not just oil. There's lots of stuff that Venezuela has. And I'm sure if you look, they probably have cobalt. They probably have all kinds of stuff for batteries. They probably have lots of stuff. The Trump administration is repatriating 2 survivors. The men who survived were being returned to their home countries, Colombia and Ecuador, for detention and prosecution. That's what the president said. Mr. Trump posted a 29-second video showing the semi-submersible vessel that was traveling partially below the water being blown up. He said 2 other suspected drug smugglers, whom he called terrorists, had been killed in the attack. Well, if you wanted to kill them, why would you just release them back to their own country? Why wouldn't you bring them to the United States for prosecution? I know why. It was not immediately possible to confirm that either 11 had agreed to so they haven't agreed to prosecute the 2 men, but Trump and his United States already sent them back to their countries. So here it is. There it is. That's the submarine they say was carrying drugs, and then they bombed it. That's what they did. And then 2 people lived. So Trump unclassified that video. So Colombia had no immediate comment. An official in Ecuador said the government was confirming that one of its nationals was among the survivors. If that were the case, the official said he could be brought to Ecuador, but Trump had previously described people aboard suspected drug smuggling boats, which the United States has targeted in several deadly airstrikes. He called them unlawful combatants. He has claimed the authority, widely disputed by legal experts, to summarily kill such suspects in military strikes as if they were enemy soldiers in a war. Even if they're what he says, they're just drug runners, you don't get to bomb them. You have to arrest them and prove it. We're not at war with Venezuela. It was a sharp, well, we actually are. It's a war we're initiating. It's a war of aggression. It's more imperialism. It was a sharp break from the traditional handling of maritime smuggling, in which the Coast Guard would intercept boats, arrest the people if suspicions proved accurate. That's how you're supposed to handle this. But this isn't about drug running, because the drugs aren't coming from Venezuela. This is about Donald Trump getting rid of Maduro and installing a puppet like Juan Guaido. That's what this is about. The decision to transfer the 2 survivors, however, was in line with the Coast Guard's practice of repatriating or handing off to friendly countries people who were intercepted outside the United States as suspected traffickers. It also avoided the dilemma of what to do with the first people captured in what Mr. Trump has declared a formal armed conflict against drug cartels. Holding them as indefinite wartime detainees at the military prison in Guantanamo Bay could have opened the door to a court reviewing whether this really is a war as part of a habeas corpus lawsuit. So the last thing Trump wants to do is have a court look into all these murders he's committing of these people in boats in Venezuela and what that's actually about. They don't want that. They don't want to have a hearing in front of a judge. They don't want them to be able to present evidence. They don't want any of that. That's why they're bombing them. And then if anybody survives, they send them back to their own country. Prosecuting the men in the U.S. civilian court would have raised other problems. For one, it was not known if any courtroom admissible evidence was available to demonstrate that the survivors of the attack, so they didn't have any evidence. So there's no evidence that these people they're bombing are actually running drug. So if they brought that to court, they would be embarrassed. Also, avoiding legal and logistical headaches by sending the men home seemed to contradict the administration's stance that suspected drug smugglers pose such a severe danger that Mr. Trump can have them military summarily kill them. So if there's such a danger, wouldn't you want to kill them? The Trump administration has justified its attacks on drug smuggling suspects in the Caribbean as a formal armed conflict and as national defense, but without offering an explanation for how it can legitimately treat the crime of drug smuggling as if it were an armed attack or combat. The administration has stressed that about 100,000 Americans die from drug overdoses each year, but the surge in overdoses has been driven by fentanyl, which comes from Mexico, not South America. And that's according to the Drug Enforcement, that's according to the DEA and the Justice Department and the Congressional Research Service. So all these bodies inside the United States government working under Trump are completely contradicting what Trump is saying. That the drugs aren't coming from Venezuela. The drugs that are killing people in the United States are coming from Mexico. And who says that? His own DEA says that. The Justice Department says that. And the Congressional Research Service says that. Mr. Trump asserted in his post that intelligence had confirmed that the semi-submersible craft had been loaded up with, well, if you've confirmed it, why wouldn't you show us the evidence? It had been loaded up with fentanyl and other illegal narcotics, even though we know fentanyl is coming from Mexico. And that at least 25,000 Americans would die if I allowed this submarine to come ashore. He did not offer evidence for his assertion about what it was carrying or about the possible consequences if the vessel reached the United States. The two men were the only survivors of the military strike late Thursday on a so-called semi-submersible vessel that was traveling partially below water. 3 of the U.S. officials with knowledge of the operation said special operations aircraft had fired on the vessel in the Southern Caribbean after U.S. intelligence analysts assessed it was carrying some kind of drugs. Were those the same U.S. intelligence analysts who said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? Minutes after the strike, analysts watched. So they were floating the Pentagon. Okay, we got you. On Saturday, officials said the Pentagon transferred legal custody of the 2 detainees to the State Department. Blah blah. The apparent blah 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 blah. So Alex Tabarek says bizarre and troubling that the United States kills at sea without a trial, but won't try to prosecute the survivors in open court. That's because that's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. So the people on these boats are terrorists who can be killed without any due process. But if they don't die in the initial strike, they just get released to go home without warning? Seriously? Oh. Yeah. Seriously. So you can summarily kill them, but if they don't get killed, you just let them go. Isn't that weird? That seems weird to me. Here's the weirdest part about this. MSNBC agree. Of course, the establishment agrees with what Trump is doing. That's why they had a No Kings rally, and nobody made a demand of anything. Like, hey, stop invading other countries, stop the war machine. Nothing. Because the Democrat billionaires and the Republican billionaires all agree they want to overthrow Venezuela. They're always for. The New York Times is always for war and overthrowing governments like we did in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, Afghanistan, and now Venezuela. And here it is. This is Richard Haas. He was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is where all the horrible, evil fuckery happens at the Council on Foreign Relations. They're the ones behind every regime change war we've done, everything. They're behind it. So here's what he had to say.
In a neighborhood to go after a couple of boats. Yeah. This is about regime change, which by the way, I think is potentially.
He's admitting it. So the guy who was the head of the Council on Foreign Relations is saying this is about regime change. This isn't about this drug war. This is that's just as big as lie as when Kash Patel says that there was no Epstein files. Epstein wasn't working with it. It's just as big a lie as that. And of course, the shit libs at MSNBC and the Council on Foreign Relations and the shit libs in the Democratic Party and the warmongers in the Republic, they're all on board. So the stuff that Trump is doing that they should oppose, of course, they don't oppose him because they agree with it. They agree with funding Ukraine. They agree with funding the genocide in Gaza. They agree with bombing Yemen. They agree with bombing Iran. They also agree with overthrowing Venezuela. And here they are saying it on MSNBC, and nobody has a problem with it. Let's listen.
In a neighborhood to go after a couple of boats. Yeah. This is about regime change, which by the way, I think is potentially a good thing, given how Maduro has run Venezuela into the ground, how he stole an election, and the rest.
So when we get involved in Latin America, it doesn't always turn.
So we get to decide if somebody else has a bad election, even though Trump said the 2020 election was rigged against him. Did that mean Venezuela could start bombing us because they thought that Joe Biden threw the election? Or do we have to figure it out in our own country? Why can't we let the people in Venezuela? So that's just another bullshit reason. Oh, he did a fake election. He did a rigged election in Venezuela. That's up for the Venezuelan people to figure out. That's not up for us.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's why I said in principle.
Yeah.
This is like there's a complicated backstory.
Yeah.
So we've got to be really careful. It's one thing to oust a regime, and we could probably deal with Maduro, some version of how we dealt with Noriega in Panama, but it's something very different once you've ousted a regime to successfully midwife the emergence of an enduring, more positive regime. Lots of things have to happen politically, economically. A lot of signals have to be sent. A lot of preparations have to be made. I would argue it also ought not to be done unilaterally. We ought to try to find others in the hemisphere to work with us. So in principle, I think the people of Venezuela could be far better off under an alternative leadership.
Name one country that the United States has cooed and overthrown their government where the people are better off. Name one country. Look what we did to Ukraine. We overthrew their democratically elected government, and then we got 1.5 million of their people killed in a proxy war with Russia that didn't have to happen. That's what we did to Ukraine. Look at Iraq. Look how well Iraq is doing. Look at what happened in Iran. We overthrew their government, and then they put in we put in a puppet, and then they have an authoritarian theocracy to replace it. Now the people in Iran, instead of living in a great democracy like they were, now they live in an authoritarian regime run theocracy because we overthrew their government so we could steal their oil. Look at the people in Libya, the most successful country in all of Africa. We overthrow Libya, and now it's run by terrorists with open slave markets. Name one country that's better off because we did what this guy's advocating and what Trump is trying to do. He doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. He cares about stealing their natural resources. That's what this has always been about. That's what it always will be about. And it's not just Trump. They've been trying to do it for 30 years, overthrow Maduro. Okay. That's that. Come see us in Australia. Second show's added in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. We'll see you in Burbank, California, the day after Thanksgiving. It's a Friday. And then Pottstown, Pennsylvania, December 6th. Plus, January 11th, we're going to be in Waikiki at the Blue Note. Tickets not available yet for them, but go to jimmydore.com for a link for all the other tickets.
The 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump, has proven once again his unpredictability and tendency to change even the most strategically important decisions drastically. As you probably already know, Trump refused to meet with Vladimir Putin in Budapest. Furthermore, he imposed tough sanctions on Russia's oil sector. Simultaneously with this, the European Union imposed the 19th package of sanctions against the Russian Federation. It is noteworthy that these restrictions are also designed to deal a powerful blow to the Russian oil sector. In particular, according to these new sanctions, Europe will completely abandon purchases of Russian liquefied natural gas by January 2027. Additionally, 800 Russian oil tankers, and numerous organizations in India and China, that cooperate with Russian companies such as Rosneft and Gazpromneft, fell under restrictions. By the way, it is worth noting that Russia reacted very negatively to Donald Trump's refusal to meet with Vladimir Putin in Budapest, the capital of Hungary. In particular, Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, officially stated that Donald Trump's refusal from the negotiation process is not only pressure on Russia, but a real act of war. According to him, the United States has now stopped hiding under the slogans of peace and democracy, and has begun to act openly. The United States has stopped pretending. The Trump administration is no longer playing peacemaker. The Americans have proved that they only need weapons and power over the whole world. However, there is one big plus in all this. The illusions have disappeared. Now, Russia has a free hand, and Moscow can respond harshly, without looking back at Western assessments and empty talk about so-called diplomacy, Dmitry Medvedev said. By the way, the fact that the day before Russia launched the world's deadliest nuclear ballistic missiles Yars and Sineva, with the participation of strategic Russian nuclear submarines and long-range bombers, indicates that Russia was well aware that the United States was planning to put an end to dialogue and go for an open confrontation.
Внимание, расчет. Пуск. Есть пуск. Начало запуска.
All these missile launches were carried out as part of large-scale nuclear war exercises, and were designed to show the West that the world's most powerful nuclear triad is activated, and ready to strike at Russia's enemies on the first order of the Supreme Commander. Moreover, as you may recall, earlier this month, I shared a video in which I informed you that the Yars strategic nuclear complexes were observed at the Plesetsk orbital spaceport, in the Arkhangelsk region. Back then, I assumed that Russia was preparing a tough response to the provocative statements of the top leadership of NATO and the European Union, and their incessant attempts to escalate the conflict to the limit. In addition, everything that was happening indicated that, following the Alaska summit, Moscow was finally convinced that the U.S. commitment to its NATO allies would not allow the Trump administration to achieve a just peace in Ukraine, considering Russia's national interests. And as you can see, I was right. 2 weeks after the publication of my video, Vladimir Putin ordered not only to launch large-scale nuclear war exercises, but also to put the world's most powerful nuclear triad on high alert. Obviously, with such radical methods, Vladimir Putin has sent a clear signal to the United States and its NATO allies that Russia is ready for any development, and that even the most devastating economic sanctions will not prevent Moscow from achieving all its goals in Ukraine. My friends, the fact is that we are all in a hazardous situation right now. The approaching victory of Russia in the framework of a special military operation in Ukraine is forcing NATO countries to raise the level of escalation both on the battlefield and in the economic war. As you can see, the West cannot afford to lose, and therefore continues not only to impose new sanctions against Russia, but also to send new weapons systems to Ukraine, along with active duty officers and soldiers of NATO allied countries. However, as you can see, the Russian authorities expected such a reaction, and prepared in advance for any development of events. That is why the Russian army continues to advance on the battlefield, even despite the Western sanctions and unprecedented military assistance from NATO countries to Ukraine. Thus, as you can see, the current conflict in Ukraine is essentially a war between the West and Russia. Yes, this is a genuine struggle for global redivision. Ukraine is merely a battleground, where forces of evil and good have clashed. Unfortunately, amid many failures on both the battlefield in Ukraine and the economic war, the West is still desperately trying to maintain the old world order. And, as you can see, for this purpose, Western globalists are willing to ignite a true global war. In this context, it's not guaranteed that tomorrow, when you look out the window, you won't see a mushroom cloud from a nuclear explosion. Nevertheless, let's hope that Vladimir Putin's wisdom and Russia's combat capabilities will finally cool the hot heads of Western globalists and allow the world to avoid a catastrophe in the form of a nuclear war.
Let's talk about Ukraine. Let's talk about Russia and where things stand right now in this war. And then we're going to talk about Venezuela a little bit later. Well, is Putin done with talking? Are we? Everything is done, but the bombing campaign right now. Are we done with talking? Are we done with diplomacy? Let's bring in Colonel Douglas Macgregor now to talk about where things stand in the current war. And then I want to talk about some other things with him just coming up after the break. Colonel, it seems like, well, these peace talks falling apart. Doesn't really seem to be much of an appetite for peace in the West. I don't exactly know what's happening here. This back and forth, Trump saying it's on, then it's off. This Budapest peace summit. Putin seems like he's done listening to all of these fools in the West right now. What will become of this war?
Well, the war is going to continue until the Russians end it on terms that they're happy with. I think that's been true for a long time now. There's no question about who is prevailing on the battlefield. So that's a foregone conclusion. I think what Putin was looking for was something more than a meaningless ceasefire, which would have left the Zelensky regime in power, changed nothing fundamentally inside Ukraine. What he wants, obviously, is a neutral Ukraine that's not going to present a threat to Russia in the future. I think President Trump would like to give him that. But President Trump is surrounded by people who are telling him he can't do it. And their reason is very simple. We cannot be humiliated by Russia as though we're being humiliated. President Trump needs to get back to what he said earlier. This is President Biden's war. President Biden built Ukraine up into this dangerous military monster that was trying to destroy Russia. We don't have any interest in that. We want to normalize relations with Russia. We can get along with Russia. That was Trump's mantra. He needs to get back to it. We have nothing to gain by war with Russia. We have everything to gain by establishing peace in Ukraine. And I think that's eminently achievable. But what his European allies want is for the Russians to get on their knees, beg for forgiveness, disarm themselves, and march home. That's not going to happen.
So you guys have heard of the bearskin hoodie, right? It's my favorite hoodie. It's the one I'm wearing right now with the removable patches on the side. This thing is built like a tank. This thing is incredibly warm when I walk the dog. It just turned really cold. We got a big...
Europe even care about Ukraine at this point? I mean, what do you surmise now they are actually, let me ask you about this, because there are reports that because of the US government shutdown that Germany is paying NATO soldiers, whereas before that was the United States obligation. Is this going to wake them up? Like, oh shoot, now we have to pay for this?
I have no idea. I know that one of the things that President Trump asked me in private in 2020 was, what do you think it will take for the Germans to invest in their own defense and create a new defense force? I said, for us to leave Germany. And he agreed. He knew that. I think what President Trump wants to do makes sense. He wants to shed our overseas obligations as much as he can. The problem is that he has no support for that inside the Beltway and the people around him. And these are the same people that want to continue to pursue Israeli hegemony at the expense of Israel's neighbors in the Middle East. They also want perpetual war with Russia. And President Trump is being told, I'm sure, if you do this, you will look weak. If you do this, you will not be seen as having, quote unquote, defeated the Russians. Well, no kidding. That's not going to happen. Russia is not going to be defeated. We need to give up on that option, and we need to do business with Russia. Ukraine is not the 51st state. We have no vital strategic interest in the place. He knows that. He's got to stand up and say it and send these other people away, but he's not doing it. He likes optics. Let's face it, he likes to look great in front of everybody. He wants to be credited with doing wonderful things. And he's afraid that if he goes and meets with Putin and says, I've had it with the Ukrainians, I'm willing to accept these boundaries, and that's what he should do. He should draw the damn boundaries. That's what happened in European history for hundreds of years. You think that little countries, little groups of people on the periphery were given the opportunity to reject agreements between the great powers of Europe? Of course not. The great powers of Europe were always interested in peace. And that's what we should be interested in, peace, putting an end to this. He needs to draw the boundaries jointly with President Putin and present them and say, these are what I support. And he should also say, I am the leader of NATO. Stop sending equipment to Ukraine. Ukraine needs to clean up. It has to have elections. It has to have a new government. He's the leader of NATO. He can do that. Obviously, he's not the leader of NATO, though, because he's not doing it.
The one more question on this, and I want to pivot here after the break, but strategically, Putin's sitting there right now, the Russian army, they're about to head into a cold winter. You're tired of this back and forth. This war will continue, as you say, on their own terms. They will end it on their own terms. From a military standpoint, Colonel, what do you think the Russians are preparing for as we head into this winter? Strategically, certain cities, we know that I think the last week they just grabbed another 4 villages. In one afternoon, 550 Ukrainians were killed, eliminated, not surrendered, eliminated in just one village. So strategically, where do you think the Russians are? How are they preparing for the winter?
Well, the Russians are prepared for the winter. They're not going to freeze. They're going to be warm and comfortable. If anything, this is probably the best cared for Russian army in history. And President Putin and his generals have gone to great lengths to make sure people are living in good conditions. The issue is what happens to Ukraine in the winter. And with the destruction of the energy grid in Ukraine, and the expectation right now is that the winter in Ukraine this year will be the worst in the last 20 years. Now, forecasts are forecasts. We don't know what it'll be, but that seems to be what people are anticipating. And that means a lot of Ukrainians are going to die because they can't heat their homes. They can't heat the buildings they're in. Now, I'm sure that doesn't affect Mr. Zelensky, but the truth is that the Ukrainian people are going to suffer terribly. That's part of the strategy, to be blunt. It's not because Mr. Putin wants to kill Ukrainians. He'd rather not. He's not interested in killing Orthodox Slavs. That seems to be a specialty that Mr. Zelensky has developed. But there's no end to this until this regime in Kiev goes away. I think that's the bottom line. Well, it will be interesting to see what the Russians are willing to do as the winter gets worse. The big advantage of winter, of course, is that the ground is frozen and it allows for better mobility. And if your enemy is freezing, he's not likely to be very robust. At this point, the Ukrainian army on the ground is in tatters. It's in chaos and destruction.
I think he is. The next day, I think he's not. In fact, 1 hour, I think he is. And the next hour, I think he's not. What's your thinking on that?
George, it's good to see you. I'm glad that you're walking free on the streets of Great Britain. I don't think that President Trump is in a position to solve very much of anything. Now, we can talk about some of the constraints on him, but I think what we saw happen with the trip to Budapest was he was surrounded by various people, donors, representatives, people on the Hill, making it clear that they don't want an agreement with President Putin unless it involves Russia's unilateral surrender and humiliation. And so I think President Trump decided it's better to have no agreement than a bad one. And so he stayed home. It's that simple.
This is the anniversary, it's on this day, in fact, of 1962, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was opining in my monologue about how afraid we all were of nuclear war at that point, averted only by the wisdom of the troops concerned. If they'd listened, with all respect to your profession, to the American generals, we wouldn't be talking here now. We might have had World War III. But Kennedy was level-headed and knew that if he had followed the advice of his generals, that it would lead to nuclear war. And I just don't think that people appreciate how close we are to nuclear war today. The British just landed Storm Shadow missiles deep inside Russia. Russia is now within its rights to retaliate against Britain, which is itself a nuclear power and which is itself a part of a bigger nuclear alliance. These are very, very dangerous times, Colonel.
Oh, they are. There's no question about it. The problem in the West is very simple. We have absolutely, continually, grossly underestimated Russian military power. We have ignored anything that the Russian leadership has said for at least 2 decades. Whenever they have made a plea for understanding their position vis-a-vis NATO, why they did not want NATO on their borders, why they would react strongly against such action, we simply refuse to listen. And right now, I think President Trump privately would like to see an end to this, but President Trump is unwilling to do what is required to end the conflict, and that is to admit a couple of things. First of all, President Biden's decision to build up the Ukrainian military for a major war against Russia was a serious mistake. Not only a mistake, it was a strategic error. President Trump knows that to be the case, but for some reason he's reluctant to say that. And again, I blame this on his donors. And so he's decided that since he cannot formally disengage from the conflict in Ukraine, he's going to simply turn away from it. The problem is he cannot abdicate his responsibility as the leader of NATO to the Europeans because of what you have just described. The leadership in London, in Paris, in Berlin, and I would argue Warsaw, is irresponsible. They don't know what they're doing. They're playing a very dangerous game. They are pushing harder than ever against the Russians. It is only President Putin's determination to avoid a war with NATO and the United States that keeps it from growing much worse. Now, I don't know what the future holds, but I think that President Trump, as I said, would like to turn away from it and focus elsewhere, primarily the Middle East, where I think he believes the ceasefire is meaningful. I think it's an illusion, and nothing has fundamentally changed in the Middle East. But he believes that for the moment. And at the same time, he's turning his attention to Venezuela, thinking that he can simply ignore what happens in Eastern Europe. I don't think he can, and I agree with you. What the British have just done, which is not new, they've done these things in the past, is very, very dangerous. But again, Putin is the adult in the room. The people in London, Paris, and Berlin and Warsaw cannot be characterized as adults because if they were, they would not do these things. It makes no sense.
But if can only do these things based on, and this is the conundrum that you're describing, it's only the guarantee that makes NATO meaningful at all. Britain has no army, has no navy. Its navy is stuck together by glue, and its army, if you take out all the clerks and haters and medics and the rest, would be scarcely over 40,000 strong. The same with the armies on the European mainland. They cannot go to war with Russia and can only threaten war with Russia on the premise the United States would have to. Trump, I agree with you. I think Trump wants this war to end. The barking chihuahuas and poodles and dachshunds in Europe very definitely don't. But if Trump doesn't break with them and put his foot down, this is going to go on and potentially get worse and worse, isn't it?
I agree with you, unless you remove the people who are governing in London, Paris, and Berlin in particular. And I think it's reaching the point in all three countries where the population genuinely needs to do that. They need to demand change in government. Now, in the meantime, sadly, I think President Trump is demonstrating that he is very much a politician, contrary to what he wants everybody to think, because he wants to be a little bit pregnant. He doesn't really want to bring the child to fruition and take responsibility for it, but he'd like to be pregnant. In other words, he wants to be popular with everyone, wants to get along with everyone, and he doesn't understand exactly what you described. He is the de facto leader of NATO. And if they want to break with him by insisting on carrying on this war, then he should put them in that position. Because there's no reason for us to keep 100,000 US troops from Lithuania to Romania sitting around, training from time to time, eating lots of food and costing lots of money. They are not going to march into Ukraine. They are not going to fight Russia. That's quite clear. So he ought to get them out and bring them home and be done with it. But he's reluctant to take that decision. And remember, again, he's not someone who studies the issues. He doesn't really understand the roots of the war in Ukraine. I don't think he really cares. I think he thinks it's a bad thing and would like to end it. But unless you understand why it happened to begin with, how can you end it in a way that makes sense? The Russians want to settle this thing. They want a new security arrangement for Europe. It makes infinite sense. We should have had that 20, 30 years ago. But instead of pressing ahead with that, he's backed away. You can't do that, but that's exactly what he's done. It's like having no one in the locomotive, and the locomotive is headed down the tracks at high speed. It's not a good answer.
What's the reason for these people that crowded round Trump and let it be known in no uncertain terms that they did not want peace? Is it, as Tucker Carlson has been saying, that this has been a money laundering operation, that not just the military-industrial complex, but the politicians themselves have enriched themselves with corrupt practices with all these billions, tens, scores of billions of dollars washing around unaudited?
The great Lou Dobbs once said that America has the best government money can buy. And I think we know that to be the case. We're currently governed by a collection of billionaires. You can call them oligarchs, whatever you like. And President Trump has demonstrated routinely since he took office that his administration is, quote unquote, a very transactional administration. You would like to be the ambassador to Lower Slobovia, pay your $2 million to me, and you get to be the ambassador to Lower Slobovia. Tell me what you want, and if you pay enough money, I'll see to it that you get it. That's effectively what's been going on. And these billionaires are the same ones that want to subjugate the Middle East. They want to create Israeli hegemony backed by U.S. military power all over the region. They want the same thing in Ukraine. They want to destroy Russia. Why these people are committed to these things would take us an hour to explore. But the point is, the same people pushing these bad wars and bad policies are at work in Venezuela. They're at work in the Middle East. They're at work in Eastern Europe. There's no easy way to get around it. And President Trump's problem is he owes his position in the White House to these people.
Yeah, but he is there and he can't run again. So, eaten bread is soon forgotten, as the Irish say. It's a bit of a puzzle that he's not more interested in what his legacy will be. I mean, if you could leave office as the guy who halted the potential for World War III in Europe, that would be a very considerable feather in your cap.
But he is preeminently concerned about optics, the way things look. And he believes that if he states it, it's true. If he tells someone to do something, he believes they're off and doing it. My experience with him was that he doesn't realize that simply because he tells somebody to do something, they may or may not do it. And if they don't do it, he doesn't hold anybody accountable. There's no price to be paid. You can't run a government that way. You can't run anything that way. Where there is no accountability, there's no performance. He doesn't seem to understand that. But he wants to feel good. He likes others around him to feel good. His favorite thing is to be on permanent campaign. He loves to talk to large audiences and interact with them. What he doesn't like to do is sit down, listen to a detailed briefing of some importance. Now, there is some good news. It looks like he was briefed on the Tomahawk, its limitations, the small numbers available, the problems with it. And he finally decided, well, perhaps I shouldn't press ahead with that. Everybody thinks it's because President Putin told him that this would sour Russian-American relations, and it was viewed in Moscow as an escalation in the conflict, and they would have to respond. But I don't think that was it. I think he was rather surprised when he discovered we don't have that many, and the ones that we have are only available to be launched from the ground for the Ukrainians. And if we do that, we have to put our soldiers, our personnel, if you will, on the ground, executing the mission, planning it, and so forth. I think he finally decided this is a bad idea. Well, that's a good thing. I'm damn glad he decided that because it was a very stupid idea. But that's not enough. And when President Putin talks to him, President Putin likes to think of him as the leader of NATO. And he's very frustrated because he can't do that, because there's no evidence that President Trump will put his foot down. Just as there's very little evidence that he's going to do anything to restrain Mr. Netanyahu. We don't see much evidence he's going to restrain Starmer or Macron or Merz. But he should, given his position. But he doesn't do it.
I was in Moscow briefly on my way to China, 24 hours or so. There's a lot of what you might call Trump-supporting Americans there. A considerable number, in fact. I won't embarrass them by adumbrating, but the signs are that Trump really does want to improve relations with Russia. It's perfectly possible to imagine sanctions on Russia being lifted in America before anywhere else. It's perfectly possible to imagine RT being back on the air in America while still being banned in Europe. These are strange times, Colonel.
Listen, George, President Trump wanted to normalize relations with Russia. He sent a team to Saudi Arabia shortly after he was elected, and they had good meetings in Saudi Arabia. The opportunity to normalize relations with Russia is there. Now, I don't know how much longer that's going to last if things get worse in Ukraine, which I'm afraid at this point they may. So I agree with you 100%. The problem for President Trump is this. He was elected preeminently to restore economic productivity and prosperity at home in the United States. That's what everyone that voted for him wants. That hasn't changed. No one voted for an invasion of Venezuela. No one voted for extending the war in Ukraine. And no one is interested in fighting Israel's war of conquest in the Middle East. That's all nonsense. So where is the disconnect? The disconnect is back to where we started. Money. Everything's about money and power. Money breeds power and influence. He's made promises to get where he is. He's trying to deliver, and it's disastrous for him. He needs to stand up and say, I'm the president of the United States. I have obligations to the American people. This is what I promised. I've got to deliver. Well, that would require him to shed his overseas commitments completely. He would be compelled to sign off on the best deal that he could get for the Ukrainians. He would be compelled to tell Mr. Netanyahu, I can't support your genocidal practices in Gaza or the West Bank or anywhere else. And by the way, whatever is wrong in Venezuela, I'm perfectly willing to deal with Maduro. Maduro has offered us a stake in his oil and gas industries, and I'm going to take it. That's what he would do. He's obviously not a free agent.
Let's talk about some of these other theaters then, Colonel. We know that the Holy Land is a place of miracles, but it would be the mother of all miracles if Jared Kushner, the property developer, was able to deliver us from a conflict that has lasted now for 77 years, a conflict in which the American and British, for that matter, political systems have become deeply corrupted by one side's lobby. It would be a miracle if Tony Blair, as Governor General of Gaza, it would be a miracle if Blair was able to deliver peace, certainly peace with justice. I mean, I might be, I wasn't ever at a university. I left school at 16 to work in a factory. It might just be beyond me or above me, but I honestly cannot see where they think this is going. It's not going to solve the problem. The Palestinians are still there. Their rights, their legal demands are still extant and now unsatisfiable. So how does all this end up with peace?
It doesn't. And that's my bottom line. I think the truth is as following. When this is over, you will have either Palestine or Israel, but you won't have both. And I've spent time in Israel. I actually like the Israelis personally. I thought very highly of their senior military leaders, but they've made it very clear that the only outcome that is acceptable to them is for Israel to grow larger and stronger at the expense of the Palestinians, their homes, and their position inside Israel. They have reasons that are demographic and reasons of strategy. The Israeli state believes that they are most secure when the rest of the region is balkanized, when it is divided and people are killing each other. They like that because they translate that into security for Israel. I see no evidence for that mentality changing. And I think people have to understand that I think still, even at this point, at least 80% of the Israeli population supports that. They may not like Mr. Netanyahu. I don't know of anybody who does, but that doesn't make any difference. He's viewed as a man of intelligence, as a man who is ruthless enough to make all of this happen. And we are regarded as the subordinate vassal of Greater Israel. And they expect us to support them regardless of whatever they do. Thus far, that's exactly what we've done.
Well, I watched a video of Ted Cruz today. Of where else would he be? In Israel. And another pastor from Christians for Israel or some other non sequitur like that. And the message was that Israelis, Jews actually, the pastor said, Israelis, Ted Cruz said or implied, are not just the chosen people, the superior people, and the rest of us, including the United States of America, explicitly stated at this conference today, are above the rest of us, and their interests must prevail. It's difficult for sane, rational people to compute all that, Colonel. How did we get to a stage where one of the most senior politicians in America, Ted Cruz, is openly stating that it's not America first, it's Israel first?
Worshipping at the altar of Israel is financially very rewarding, George. I can't emphasize that enough. when we talk about these wars, you have on the one hand this sort of money laundering scheme that Tucker Carlson rightly described, but you have to look at the bank accounts. There are some investigations underway of senior senators who've received millions of dollars as a result of this, what we call laundering operation. But it's more than that. If you're a senior officer in the military and you're a strident advocate for Israel and whatever it wants, which amounts to perpetual conflict with its neighbors in the region to establish their hegemony, when you retire, you are rewarded by membership in financial firms in New York City, by joining boards of directors in banks, by being appointed officers in the defense industries, by becoming enshrined as a notable personality or expert in one of the so-called think tanks in Washington. And all the think tanks are owned by the same people. They're not think tanks, they're advocacy tanks. But the point is that everyone has figured out, if you want to get rich and you want to be rewarded, be on the right side. And so that's why there is no shortage of people willing to step forward and do this. The danger for someone like President Trump is that there is an inexhaustible supply of sycophantic generals who will tell him whatever he wants to hear because it's financially rewarding to do so. The problem is, at some point, it's going to become militarily disastrous and strategically catastrophic for us. When that happens is anybody's guess, but I think we're closer to it now, as you mentioned at the outset, than perhaps we have been in decades.
My God, I wish you were.
Safely. Before we get to Russia and Ukraine today, 2 or 3 weeks after the grand signing of the Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, Gaza so-called ceasefire, was it just a scam?
The Israelis have made it clear that it was just a scam. Ben Gvir, this right-wing Israeli minister of, I guess, the interior, has said, now that we got our hostages back, and accomplish that goal, it's time to go in and kill them all. Now, so that makes it clear that the hostage deal, the hostages were a political problem for Benjamin Netanyahu, and it looks like the Israelis, at least, and maybe the United States as well, were just playing that, putting the peace plan out there is just a game, because what we see is that the Israelis are violating the ceasefire on a daily basis, and they have no intention of adhering to the terms of the agreement.
Was Trump in on this scam? I mean, now Hamas has given up. Look, from Hamas's perspective, this was a brilliant and successful military-style operation to deter and repel an unlawful occupier permitted under international law. Now they've given up one of their best tools, which is the hostages.
Well, actually, no, the hostages were taken, and Hamas said so right from the start, as a currency of exchange for Palestinians held by the Israelis. And over 1,000 plus several hundred Palestinian prisoners, hostages, were released by Israel. And so the hostages serve their purpose. It's a tragic purpose. I don't believe in hostage taking, but I know why I know why Hamas did it, because Israel kept imprisoning Gazan citizens, raping the girls. This is what they do. The Israelis are horrible, horrible people. I mean, I apologize. I'm sure there's some good ones out there. But when you tolerate a prison system that's designed to allow the guards to rape and film the rape of female prisoners so that they can blackmail them once they release them into society, saying, if you don't do our bidding, we will show this video, to your family and hope for an honor killing. This is how Israel works. This is how Israel thinks. And Hamas was able to free over 1,000 Palestinians held hostage by by Israel. So no, the hostages, that's all they were there for. There was no other benefit for Hamas to maintain these people. They got what they wanted. They got what they intended.
So what happens now? Jared Kushner's going to try and develop a portion of Gaza under the pretext that this is where the good Gazans, the one that wants to cooperate with Israel, will live. Hamas is going to be fighting and killing Israeli collaborators among them, and the IDF will be back bombing the daylights out of what remains in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, apparently the United States is dumber than dirt, and we know that Jared Kushner is dumber than dirt. He's not a very smart guy. He doesn't earn money; he has it given to him. And if people investigated that, they'd figure out that he was as corrupt as the day is long. This is just a naked effort at creating a state within a state. The Israelis have spent a lot of money, time, and effort to find Palestinians amongst the Gazan population who are willing to sell out. They have corrupted entire families. And now what they're going to do is bring these people, these collaborators, these traitors of the Palestinian cause together in a community that will be developed. And, the idea is to, this is what something akin to what they did with the Southern Liberation Army, the force they created in Southern Lebanon when they invaded and occupied Southern Lebanon, the SLA. It was designed to provide a counterbalance to the Shia population. Ultimately, Hezbollah slaughtered them, kicked them out, and sent them packing to Israel. And this will be the fate of the Gazan traitors. But, Trump is so ignorant that he didn't realize what the game was. If you remember early on, Hamas started executing these people in the streets. And Trump went, no, that's okay. They need a police force. And then when someone whispered in his ear, no, they're killing our guys. He was like, oh, we can't accept this. We will blow them to hell. This hasn't been done. You said, is Trump in on it? Apparently, Trump's in on everything. We found out now that Trump was in on the pager attack, that act of terrorism carried out by the Israelis against the population of Lebanon. Yes, some Hezbollah people were affected, but so were children, women, innocents. Trump was in on it. He's a war criminal, an admitted war criminal, and apparently he's going to sign up for some more war crimes against the Gazans.
Is the war in Ukraine now Donald Trump's war?
100%. Now, it was always Donald Trump's war. I mean, no matter how he tried to spin it, people tend to forget that Donald Trump was president for 4 years before Joe Biden. He's the man that put 20 CIA bases inside Ukraine to carry out, broader objectives that he signed off on, lethal objectives, authorizing covert action on Russian soil to, pave the way for direct action operation, combat operations. It goes beyond spying. We're talking about sabotage. We're talking about, blowing things up. This is what Donald Trump signed off on. He's the guy that helped train, what was it? One Ukrainian battalion every 55 days to go to the east and kill Russians. That's what the U.S. Army was bragging about while Donald Trump was president. No, this is Donald Trump's war. This war was going to happen because Donald Trump wrote the plan that Biden ended up implementing. Trump, everybody's allowed to have a change of a heart. And, I accept at face value that Trump said this war is going bad. I want to dump it. And of course, he's going to spin it and say it was Joe Biden's war. But that failed because now what we have is Donald Trump literally becoming an active participant in the conflict, freeing up the Ukrainians to use weaponry deep into Russia, things they couldn't do without American approval. Now he's declared economic war against Russia, sanctioning the two largest energy producers, Rosneft and Lukoil. And he's committing diplomatic war, or trying to encourage people to turn on Russia. And the goals and objectives are clear. Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, has said to collapse the Russian economy. And that's part of the overall master plan that Trump helped design in his first term to collapse the Putin administration. This is a regime change operation taking place today. It's going to fail, but no, this is Trump's war. He owns it, and now he's got to deal with the consequences.
It will not change anything on the battlefield. I'm paraphrasing Sergei Lavrov, but it will change our relationship to the United States, that Trump has authorized the use of long-range missiles. To put aside the Tomahawks for now, you've explained that to us at great detail and much appreciated. The Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that Trump authorized the use of the long-range missile. Trump today claimed that he didn't. About who knows what the truth is. He often speaks out of both sides of his mouth so that Lindsey Graham is happy and somebody else on the other side is happy. But the Russians know what's happening, don't they?
Vladimir Putin made it quite clear today. He told the Ukrainians and Europe, and that's the important part. Trump may say America had nothing to do with it. Europe does. If a European long-range weapon strikes Russia, it'll be catastrophic for both Ukraine and Europe. I don't know how to make it much clearer. He's going to strike Europe. He's not playing games. I mean, the Russians have said all along, you guys keep escalating. I think he put Trump on notice. When you hear Ushakov and others talk about a frank discussion, that means it was pretty blunt language. And I'm pretty sure that Putin made it as clear as possible that if the United States provided Tomahawks, that it wouldn't have any impact on the battlefield, but that Russia would be hitting American targets in return. That there's no way Russia would allow a Tomahawk missile to strike Russian soil and America to walk away from that one. And that's why Trump has backed off. It's the same thing that happened to Biden on September 13th of last year, where he was going to sign documents that Keir Starmer brought, and Anatoly Antonov made a frank phone call to people who told Biden what he said. We don't know exactly what it was, but from what I've heard, it was clear that Washington, D.C. would be in the target deck of Russia's retaliation. And that caused Biden to back down. And I think Trump backed down as well. Russia's not bluffing here. Now, Trump is now playing the Scott Bessent game, believing the Russian economy is weak. And so he's not going to risk escalation to military on military contact. He believes by sanctioning the major Russian oil companies that this will lead to a collapse of the Russian economy and therefore compel Putin to walk away from the war. You remember John McCain and Lindsey Graham once joked that Russia was, this weak country that had nothing. It was like a giant gas station, nuclear weapons. I think people need to understand that if you are a giant gas station, that you might know the gas station business better than anybody else, especially those people whose sole job is just to put gas in their car, which is the United States. Russia knows the global energy business better than any nation. Ask the Saudis. Every time they try to squeeze the Russians come in on the market and squeeze the Saudis. It's the Saudis who back down 100% of the time. Russia's been preparing for this moment. They're not panicked. They will have to tighten belts here, make adjustments there. But if anybody thinks that, and Vladimir Putin made it clear, real nations, genuine nations, never buckle under pressure. You're not allowed to buckle under pressure. That if you wanted concessions from Russia, this isn't the way to do it. All this does is harden Russian resolve. So we're headed towards an escalation that will result in the physical destruction of Ukraine. And if Europe's not careful, the physical destruction of several European cities.
A couple of minutes after the phone call between Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov told a press conference, "Let me reiterate, an immediate ceasefire suddenly back on the agenda as opposed to addressing the root causes of this conflict is not anything we'd be interested in." Is Rubio dumb enough to have raised that issue in the phone call? Hey, Sergei, you want the president to show up in Budapest, agree to a ceasefire? Is he crazy asking for something like that?
Well, no, because Rubio doesn't want diplomacy between the United States. The president of the United States needs to understand that Marco Rubio is a poison pill. Let's go back to the 2016 presidential campaign. Marco Rubio hates Donald Trump, despises Donald Trump. The only reason why he is the Secretary of State is that Miriam Adelson's $100 million bribe to Donald Trump, which came with the name tag that said he has to be vice president. Trump went no. So they gave him the second best thing, Secretary of State. Rubio hates Trump. Rubio hates Russians almost as much as he hates Trump. Rubio will do nothing to make this policy work. He is the poison pill, just like Mike Pompeo was, just like John Bolton was. And Donald Trump is too stupid to understand that. I mean, it's so glaringly obvious that Marco Rubio is undermining any chance for peace with Russia. And yet Donald Trump continues to soldier along because he sold his soul to literally the devil, Miriam Adelson.
Do we know who canceled the meeting in Budapest, the Russians or the Americans?
The Americans canceled it. Now the Russians are saying, yeah, it's obvious that it's not going to, what the Russians are saying, it's not going to happen now. The Russians still believe in diplomacy. Look, the Russians are the adults in the room. And so, even now you have Russian diplomats saying, yeah, we'll continue to talk to the Americans. We have to leave a safety valve here. There has to be an off-ramp, or else the consequences are inevitable, force on force. And so the Russians will continue to manage this situation properly until which time, Donald Trump, flips the other way. He's literally, the only thing that flips more than Donald Trump is a trout once you put him on the ground after pulling him out of the river.
What is the status of matters on military status on the ground in Ukraine as we speak, approaching the tail end of October?
Well, Judge, I wish you had been able to come to that dinner.
With the general, I'm kicking me. I don't want to get into the details.
No, I don't want the details.
My flight was 5 hours later than it was supposed to be. Otherwise, I would have been there, and I could have been there had I known the flight was going to be 5 hours later.
I was getting the play-by-play from Natalie, who was just apoplectic at the situation you're in and felt very badly. But Abdi Aladinov is a lieutenant general, commander of the Akhmat Special Forces, a man held in high regard, who's very honest about the situation on the battlefield. And if you could have seen look, you're a judge. You are expert in reading people. You've sat in a courtroom and you've read the faces of innocent people, the faces of guilty people, the faces of liars, and the faces of those who tell the truth. And I wish you could have been there to look Abdi in the eyes as he spoke and understand the genuine integrity, honesty of this man as he spoke about the reality of this conflict. Every Russian officer I've spoken to speaks in a similar fashion. It's a very difficult war. Under no circumstances will anybody tell you this is easy. It's very hard. It's literally life and death. But there's no panic in his face. There's no concern in his face. He is confident in Russia's ability to continue to prevail on the battlefield. And I believe that that's the reality. This is a very difficult war that Russia is winning.
Well, what will happen next? I mean, have the Russians gone to the other side of the Dnieper River? I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions at once. Does Zelensky realize that the end is near? Can Zelensky agree to a surrender without being assassinated?
I don't know what Zelensky's fate.
Let's start with on the ground. How close, in your view, is the Russian military to the achievement of the goals that President Putin set out?
Look, it's a grind, but they're very close to capturing Pokrovsk. And when Pokrovsk falls, the Ukrainians have to fall back on Kramatorsk. They don't have the defensive fortifications built, so Kramatorsk will be rapidly closed in on, and then the Russians will do their similar double envelopment, leave an escape valve open, and then grind away at the middle and take Kramatorsk. At that point in time, the Donetsk region will collapse and the Ukrainians will fall back. How long this will take? The Russians aren't in the business of playing to the clock or the calendar. They're in the business of getting the results. And so this could take months, weeks. It could take the rest of the year. It could last into early next year. But sooner rather than later, Russia will have taken all of Lugansk, all of Donetsk. They're already starting to consolidate their position in Dnipropetrovsk, which is purely a Ukrainian territory, in Kharkov and Sumy. And now you're seeing the Russians begin to advance in Zaporizhia. And as they advance in Zaporizhia, they'll get into a favorable position. And at some point in time, they're going to cross the river and go back into the right bank of Kherson and take that as well. And if the Ukrainians want to continue to play ball after that, then the Russians will go on to Odessa and Mykolaiv. They'll finish the occupation of Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov, Sumy. Now, on these Ukrainian territories, Russia doesn't care about the official delineation. They'll find the best defensible spot, and maybe they'll be willing to stop their advance there and do a ceasefire. But they will never agree to a ceasefire so long as Ukrainian forces are dug in on Russian soil, and the Russians view Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk in their totality to be part of Russia.
Well, can I switch gears for just a minute before we finish today? Why is Marco Rubio pushing Donald Trump to invade Venezuela?
Marco Rubio has, from the very beginning of his tenure as a senator, positioned himself to be, anti-Maduro, Hugo Chavez before that. He's been a proponent of this. This is when he got his appointment to the Foreign Relations Committee, he made going after Venezuela a top priority. That's how he separated himself from the pack. He is, of course, a Cuban in the Cuban American in the Cuban American community in Florida. They thrive on being anti-communist and opposing Cuba. Cuba's a major backer of Venezuela. So he just made this his pet project. And ever since he became a senator, he's been advocating for military operations against Venezuela. Now he's the Secretary of State, and this is his baby. This is his puppy. He's not just the Secretary of State; he's the National Security Advisor, which means he's the guy who drafted the findings signed by the president authorizing the CIA to carry out lethal covert action against Maduro. And that's where we're in right now. We're in the assassination business.
Well, lethal covert action, which is no longer covert because the president announced it. As horrific as it is, the agents are jeopardized. I got to play this clip for you, even though it's going to aggravate you a little bit. Your favorite senator from South Carolina on a show that you and I probably don't watch. But is Venezuela going to become the 51st state? Chris?
I had a chat with you this weekend, and I thought you had a pretty darn good idea. And you said you were going to share it with the president. I want to know if you did. And that is this opposition leader in Venezuela that won the Nobel Prize that said it really deserved to go to Donald Trump. Sounds like a pretty good leader to me for the people of Venezuela and the end of narco-terrorism and a better relationship with the U.S. Or if they choose maybe the 51st state, I don't know.
Sounds good to me. But the opposition.
Stupid is as stupid does, and like minds tend to congregate. Me and Larry Johnson hung out together in Moscow for a reason, and I'm sorry, Lindsey Graham and oh gosh, who was that? Sean Hannity.
I don't know who the other fellow was, but Sean Hannity. Yeah.
I mean, these are people that long ago stopped being able to think, and they are simply mouthpieces of the organs of hegemony. I don't know what's going to happen in Venezuela. I do believe that we are going to end up in some sort of war with Venezuela. I do believe we will overthrow the Maduro government because we're the United States and that's what we do. But we overthrew Gaddafi, and look at Libya today, just a disaster. We overthrew Saddam Hussein, look at Iraq, a disaster. We helped orchestrate the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, look at Syria, a disaster. And if we remove Maduro from Venezuela, it will be a disaster. Now the president's talking about Colombia as well. This Marco Rubio, everybody screamed about Henry Kissinger, who of course was the last Secretary of State to dual hat as a national security advisor, as being a war criminal. And his entire life that hounded him because of his illegal bombing of Cambodia and Laos and such, what he did in South America. Marco Rubio will go down in history as one of America's most notorious war criminals. The things that he will be responsible for, not just in the Middle East, the genocide against the Palestinian people, not just underwriting the continued murder of Ukrainian men on the battlefield, but what he's doing right now in Venezuela and Colombia, the illegal covert actions that he's authorizing as the National Security Advisor. When the truth becomes known, Marco Rubio's name will be carved into the stones in the deepest pit of hell, because that's where he belongs.
Scott Ritter, thank you very much, my friend. It was fabulous hanging out with you in Moscow. I learned a great deal. As you know, I'm sorry I missed the dinner with the general, but we will do it again, my dear friend. Next
Absolutely.
time, Moscow and St. Petersburg. I think we're going to be there together in June.
I hope so.
Yes, all the best.
Cuff it. Follow me.